The fundamental distinction that elevates our literary endeavors above those frivolous works of fantasy, those monstrous creations, born not from nature's careful design, but from the fevered imaginations of disordered minds, works that an esteemed critic once deemed fit only for lining pastry cooks' trays, is our unwavering commitment to truth. Yet, in this noble pursuit, we must equally guard against mirroring that other breed of history, which a celebrated poet has suggested, is brewed specifically for the tavern's profit, insisting that its consumption must forever be accompanied by a foaming tankard of good ale. The poet captures this relationship perfectly in his couplet, describing how history with her comrade ale soothes the sad series of her serious tale. For if this intoxicating liquor serves as the very lifeblood of the modern historian, nay, their very muse, if we are to credit the opinion of Butler, who attributed divine inspiration to the humble ale, then it follows logically that it must become the necessary potion of their readers as well. Is it not universally acknowledged that every book should be consumed with the same spirit and energy in which it was conceived? This principle found perfect illustration when the famously eccentric author of Hurlothrumbo confided to a learned bishop that the reason his lordship failed to grasp the sublime excellence of his work was simply that he did not read it with a fiddle in hand, the very instrument that had been the author's constant companion during its entière composition. Therefore, to ensure our own work remains clearly distinguished from the laborious chronicles of these ale-inspired historians, we have deliberately seized every opportunity to adorn our narrative with a rich tapestry of similes, vivid descriptions, and various other poetical ornaments. These literary embellishments serve fundamentally as a substitute for the aforementioned ale, acting as refreshing draughts for the weary mind. If you're enjoying this deep dive into literary craftsmanship, be sure to subscribe for more content that bridges classic literature and modern storytelling. They stand as deliberate interruptions placed at strategic intervals to ward off the mental slumber that inevitably creeps upon both reader and writer during the lengthy journey through an extended work. Let us speak plainly, without such intentional diversions. Even the most compelling narrative of plain, unadorned fact would eventually overwhelm and exhaust every reader. For what mortal possesses the eternal vigilance that Homer ascribed only to Jove himself? Such divine watchfulness would indeed be necessary to endure a multi-volume work as dry and monotonous as a lengthy newspaper. We shall entrust to the reader's discernment the judgment of how wisely we have selected the moments for inserting these ornamental embellishments. However, it must be conceded that no occasion could appear more fitting than the present one, where we stand at the very precipice of introducing a character of considerable importance onto our stage, none other, in fact, than the heroine of this heroic historical prosaic poem. Therefore, we have deemed it absolutely essential to prepare the reader's mind for her grand entrance by filling it with every delightful image we can possibly summon from the vast and beautiful canvas of nature itself. For this method of preparation we find ample precedent throughout the established arts. First, consider the sophisticated practice of our tragic poets, who have mastered this very craft of anticipation. They rarely fail to prime their audience psychologically for the arrival of their principal characters. A hero never merely walks on stage. He is always heralded by a triumphant flourish of drums and trumpets, a sonic barrage deliberately designed to stir the martial spirit within the audience's breast and to attune their ears to the ensuing bombast and fustian. Indeed, Mr. Locke's hypothetical blind man would not have erred grossly in comparing such lofty language to the resonant blast of a military trumpet. Conversely, when star-crossed lovers are destined to appear, they are often escorted onto the stage by the gentle melting strains of soft music meant either to soothe the audience with the tender passions of romance or to lull them into a gentle reverie, perfectly setting the emotional mood for the amorous scene that will follow. This secret of preparation is known not only to the poets, but also to their masters, the cunning managers of the playhouses, who understand audience psychology intimately. Beyond the expected kettle drums that announce the hero's approach, he is typically preceded by a veritable troupe of half a dozen scene shifters, whose bustling presence consciously amplifies his importance. The perceived necessity of this ritual finds perfect illustration in a delightful theatrical anecdote that has circulated through backstage corridors for years. The story tells of King Pyrrhus, who was once thoroughly engrossed in dining at an alehouse adjacent to the theatre when his cue to appear on stage was urgently called. The hero, torn between his profound reluctance to abandon a succulent shoulder of mutton and his equally strong unwillingness to draw the indignation of Mr. Dan Wilkes, his co-manager for making the audience wait, had resorted to the practical solution of bribing these very harbingers to disappear temporarily. What do you think makes a truly memorable character? Introduction. Comment your thoughts below. Thus, while Mr. Wilkes thundered backstage, repeatedly demanding, "Where are the carpenters to walk on before King Pyrrhus?" that monarch very quietly continued eating his mutton, and the impatient audience had no choice but to entertain themselves with the interim music until the situation resolved itself. To speak plainly, I strongly suspect that the seasoned politician, who typically possesses a keen nose for manipulating public perception, has detected the profound utility of this practice in his own realm. I remain convinced that the awe-inspiring magistrate, the Lord Mayor of London, accrues a significant portion of the reverence that surrounds him throughout his term, directly from the numerous pageants and elaborate displays that carefully precede his official pomp. Nay, I must confess that even I, who am not particularly susceptible to the superficial allure of mere spectacle, have found myself unexpectedly and deeply impressed by the psychological power of much preceding state ceremony. Observing a man strutting with immense self-importance in a formal procession preceded by others whose sole function is to walk ceremoniously before him has invariably planted in my mind a far loftier notion of his dignity than if I had simply encountered him in a commonplace, everyday situation. But one particular example aligns perfectly with our present purpose, the time-honored custom of dispatching a basket woman to precede the royal pomp at a coronation. Her sole duty is to strew the sacred path with fragrant flowers before the great personages commence their solemn procession. The ancients, without a doubt, would have formally invoked the goddess Flora for this sacred task, and their cunning priests or pragmatic statesmen would have had remarkably little difficulty persuading the common people of the deity's actual presence, even though a plain mortal woman actually personified her and performed her office. We, however, harbor no such intention to deceive our valued reader. Therefore, those who take offense at heathen mythology may, if they wish, freely transform our goddess into the aforementioned basket woman without losing the essential meaning. Our intention, stated simply, is to introduce our heroine with the utmost solemnity we can possibly muster, employing an elevated style and all other requisite circumstances to raise the veneration of our reader to its highest possible pitch. Indeed, for certain private reasons we hold close, we would seriously advise those male readers among us who possess hearts of any particular sensitivity to read no further at this point. We would offer this warning were we not firmly convinced that, however amiable the portrait of our heroine may appear, and it is, in truth, a faithful copy from nature, many of our fair countrywomen will be found wholly worthy to satisfy any passionate expectation and to answer any ideal of female perfection which our literary pencil shall aspire to raise. And now, without any further preface, we solemnly turn the page and proceed with our narrative. Let a profound hush fall upon this moment, every crude noise silenced into reverence. May the pagan monarch who rules the tempests lock away the roaring Boreas in unyielding iron chains and muzzle the sharp-nosed eastern wind Eurus, whose bite brings such bitter cold. And you, sweet Zephyrus, I call upon you. Now rise from your fragrant bed of blossoms, ascend the western horizon in all your majesty, and summon those delicious breezes whose very essence coaxes the lovely Flora from her chamber perfumed with morning's pearly dew. Picture this perfect scene on the 1st of June, her blessed birthday. The blooming maiden emerges in flowing delicate attire, stepping lightly across the verdant meadow, where every flower rises in worshipful homage. The crimson tulip bows its head, the modest violet turns its face upward, the passionate rose releases its intoxicating perfume until the entire field transforms into a magnificent enameled tapestry with vibrant colors and intoxicating fragrances competing in joyful rivalry to see which can delight the goddess most completely. May our heroine now materialize with that same breathtaking enchantment, and you nature's feathered choristers, you nightingales and larks, whose sweetest melodies surpass even the genius of Handel, now tune your melodious throats to celebrate her glorious arrival. Remember, your music springs from love, and to love it must inevitably return. Let your harmonies awaken that tender passion in every youthful heart that hears them, for behold, adorned with every conceivable charm that nature can bestow, bedecked with that rare constellation of beauty, youth, sprightliness, innocence, modesty, and tenderness, breathing sweetness from her rosy lips, as if they were indeed blossoming flowers, and darting brilliant light from her sparkling eyes that outshine the stars themselves. The truly magnificent Sophia makes her entrance onto life's stage. Tell me, dear reader, have you ever stood in reverent awe before the celebrated statue of the Venus de Medici, that marble embodiment of perfection. Or perhaps you have wandered through the famed gallery of beauties at Hampton Court, that collection of female excellence preserved for posterity. You may recall each radiant Churchill of that dazzling constellation, and all the celebrated toasts of the Kit Kat Club, whose beauty inspired poets and shaped allegiances. Or if their era preceded your time, then surely you have witnessed their daughters, the no less dazzling beauties of our present age, whose names alone, were we to catalogue them here, would fill this entire volume with their renown. Now, if you have been blessed to behold all these paragons of beauty, fear not receiving the crude retort which Lord Rochester once delivered to a man who boasted of having seen many remarkable things. No, in this particular case, if you have seen all these legendary beauties without recognizing true beauty when it appears before you, then you truly possess no eyes. If you have contemplated them without feeling beauty's irresistible power stirring within your soul, then you truly have no heart. Finding yourself captivated by Sophia's introduction, don't forget to subscribe for more exquisite character revelations and literary analysis. Yet, even with all this, my friend, it remains entirely possible that you may have studied all these celebrated beauties without being able to form a precise, accurate conception of our Sophia, for she resembled none of them exactly. She bore some passing similarity to the renowned portrait of Lady Ranelagh art critics noted, and I have heard from those with longer memories that she mirrored even more closely the famous Duchess of Mazarine, that fabled beauty of a bygone generation. But most profoundly she brought to mind one particular woman whose image can never ever fade from my heart, and whom, if you happen to remember, then you have indeed, my dear friend, formed a perfectly adequate idea of our Sophia's essence. But should fortune have denied you this particular reference point, we shall endeavor, with our utmost literary capability, to describe this paradigm of femininity, though we remain acutely aware that our highest talents prove woefully insufficient for such a monumental undertaking. Sophia, then the only daughter of the respected Mr. Weston, possessed a figure best described as medium in stature, yet with a carriage and presence that suggested a leaning toward tallness. Her form was not merely geometrically perfect, but radiated an extremely delicate elegance that spoke of both inherent strength and natural grace. The exquisite proportion of her arms visible below the fashionable sleeves of her gown promised perfect symmetry in her limbs that remained modestly concealed. Her hair of the deepest raven black grew with such luxuriant abundance that it once cascaded to her waist before she reluctantly cut it to conform to contemporary fashion. Even now it curled in such artful, natural tendrils about her neck that few observers could believe it. Her own unadorned hair, suspecting instead some masterful coiffeur's addition. If envy, that green-eyed monster that feeds on beauty's light, could identify any single feature deserving slightly less praise than the others, it might possibly whisper that her forehead could have been somewhat higher without diminishing her overall splendor. Her eyebrows formed perfect natural arches, full and symmetrical beyond what any cosmetic art could hope to replicate. Her dark eyes contained an innate luminosity, a spark of keen intelligence and vivacious spirit that even her inherent gentleness could not completely mask. Her nose followed classically perfect lines, and her mouth, housing two immaculate rows of ivory teeth, perfectly embodied Sir John Suckling's famous description in those timeless lines. Her lips were red, and one was thin, compared to that was next her chin. Some bee had stung it newly. Her cheeks followed the elegant oval shape so prized by portrait artists, and in her right cheek nature had placed a delightful dimple that revealed itself at the slightest suggestion of a smile indeed, even at the mere anticipation of amusement. Her chin certainly contributed significantly to her facial harmony, though it defied simple categorization as either large or small, though careful study might suggest it leaned toward the former. Her complexion displayed more of the lily's pristine purity than the rose's vivid blush, but when physical exertion or becoming modesty enhanced her natural coloration, no vermilion pigment in any artist's collection could hope to match its brilliance. Then one might truly exclaim with the celebrated Dr. Donne, whose words perfectly captured this phenomenon. Her pure and eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks, and so distinctly wrought that one might almost say her body thought. Her neck was elegantly long and finely sculpted, a column of perfect proportion. And here, were I not constrained by proper concern for her delicate sensibilities, I might justly claim that even the supreme beauties of the renowned Venus de Column, Medicis, were visibly surpassed. Here was a whiteness that no lily, no polished ivory, nor even the finest alabaster could hope to equal. The most exquisite cambric fabric might well be suspected of enviously attempting to conceal that bosom which nature had made whiter than the cloth itself. It was indeed, as the classical poet described another legendary beauty, nitor splendens pario marmor pureus, a gloss shining beyond the purest brightness of Parian marble. Such was the exquisite external form of Sophia, nor was this beautiful vessel disgraced by an inhabitant unworthy of such a magnificent temple. Her mind proved in every aspect equal to her physical form. Indeed, her body actually derived additional beauty from the spirit within, for when she smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached and illuminated her eyes, the inherent sweetness of her character diffused a particular radiance across her countenance that no mere perfection of features could possibly provide. But since all mental perfections inevitably reveal themselves through that intimate familiarity to which we plan to introduce our reader with this captivating young woman, it seems somewhat redundant to catalogue them here in dry inventory. Indeed, doing so would represent a tacit insult to our readers' intelligence and deductive abilities, and might also deprive them of the distinct pleasure derived from gradually forming their own assessment of her character through her actions and conversations. Which quality matters most in a heroine? Beauty, intelligence, or moral strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It may, however, be appropriate to acknowledge that whatever innate mental talents nature had generously bestowed upon her, they had been thoughtfully refined and cultivated through education and art, for she had been educated under the diligent supervision of a maiden aunt, a woman of significant discretion and sharp understanding, thoroughly versed in worldly ways, having resided at court during her youth before retiring to the countryside some years prior. Through her aunt's constant guidance and careful instruction, Sophia acquired impeccable formal manners, though she perhaps lacked some of that effortless social ease that comes only from long habit and continuous residence within what society terms the polite circle. But this social polish, to speak frankly, often comes at too high a cost to authenticity and innocence, and though it possesses charms so inexpressible that the French, perhaps attempting to define this elusive quality, among others famously declare they know not precisely what it is, its absence in Sophia was more than compensated by her natural innocence and genuine warmth of spirit. Nor can genuine intelligence and innate gentility of heart, such as Sophia possessed in abundance, ever truly require such artificial acquisition to shine with their own legitimate light. The amiable Sophia had now blossomed into her 18th year when she makes her proper entrance into our historical narrative. Her father, as previously established, cherished her beyond any other human creature, seeing in her not only his daughter, but the very light of his existence. It was to this beloved young woman, therefore, that Tom Jones decided to appeal, hoping to engage her compassionate interest on behalf of his unfortunate friend, the gamekeeper, whose livelihood now hung in precarious balance. But before we proceed directly to this particular business, a brief recapitulation of some preceding events becomes necessary for full comprehension of the complex relationships at play. Though the fundamentally different temperaments of Mr. Allworthy and Mr. Weston prevented any truly intimate correspondence between them, they maintained what society would call a decent and respectful footing with one another. This civilized relationship meant that the young people of both families had been acquainted since their earliest infancy. Being all nearly of the same age, they had naturally become frequent playmates throughout their childhood, their lives intertwined, like the roots of neighboring trees growing in the same fertile soil. The inherent gaiety of Tom's spirited temperament harmonized far better with Sophia's vibrant nature than the grave and sober disposition of Master Blifil ever could. The preference she consistently demonstrated for the former often manifested so plainly that a young man of more passionate constitution than Master Blifil might have revealed visible displeasure at such marked favoritism. As he did not, however, outwardly express any such disgust, it would be an ill office indeed for us as narrators to pay an unsolicited visit to the inmost recesses of his mind. We shall not emulate those scandalous people who search into the most secret affairs of their friends, who pry into private closets and cupboards, not out of necessity but merely to discover and reveal to the world any poverty or meanness they might find concealed there. However, just as persons who suspect they may have given others cause for offense are often quick to conclude that offense has indeed been taken, so Sophia interpreted a particular action of Master Blifil's as stemming from anger. Meanwhile, the superior, or at least more self-assured sagacity of Thwackerman Square discerned in the same action the workings of a much nobler principle. The incident in question occurred years earlier when Tom Jones, then very young, had presented Sophia with a little bird he had carefully taken from its nest, patiently nursed to health, and lovingly taught to sing. This was no casual gift, but a token of genuine affection nurtured by his own hands. Of this precious bird, Sophia then, about 13 years old, grew so extremely fond that her chief occupation became feeding and tending it, and her greatest pleasure derived from playing with the delicate creature. Through these devoted attentions, little Tommy, for so the bird had been affectionately named, became so thoroughly tame that it would feed fearlessly from its mistress's hand, perch confidently upon her outstretched finger, and lie contentedly in the warmth of her bosom, where it seemed almost sensibly aware of its own extraordinary happiness. Yet Sophia always kept a small silk string fastened about its leg, never trusting it completely, with the liberty of flying away, fearing the world beyond her protection. Finding these character dynamics fascinating, be sure to like this video if you're invested in Tom and Sophia's growing connection. One fateful afternoon, when Mr. Allworthy and his entire family dined at Mr. Weston's estate, Master Blythill found himself in the garden with young Sophia. Observing the extreme fondness she displayed for her feathered companion, he politely requested that she trust the bird momentarily in his hands. Sophia, with the innate courtesy that characterized her nature, complied with the young gentleman's request, and, after issuing several earnest cautions, delivered her cherished pet into his care. No sooner had he taken possession of the bird than he swiftly slipped the string from its leg and deliberately tossed it into the open air. The foolish animal, no sooner perceiving itself at unexpected liberty, forgot all the kindness and care it had received from Sophia. It flew directly away from her, perching tentatively on a distant bough, confused by its sudden freedom. Sophia, watching her beloved bird escape, screamed so loud in dismay that Tom Jones, who was walking at some little distance, immediately came running to her assistance. The moment he understood what had transpired, he cursed Blythill for what he called a pitiful, malicious rascal. Then, immediately stripping off his coat without hesitation, he applied himself to climbing the tree to which the bewildered bird had escaped. Tom had almost recovered his little namesake when the branch supporting him, which unfortunately hung directly over a canal, suddenly snapped. The poor lad plunged headlong into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with a startling splash. Sophia's concern instantly shifted its object. Apprehending that the boy's very life might be in danger, she screamed 10 times louder than before. Indeed, even Master Blythill now seconded her alarms. With all the vociferation he could muster, his voice joining hers in panicked chorus. The company, who had been sitting in a room adjacent to the garden, were instantly alarmed by the commotion and rushed forth en masse. Just as they reached the canal's edge, Tom, the water being luckily quite shallow at that particular spot, emerged, dripping and sputtering, arriving safely on shore, though thoroughly drenched. Thwackum immediately fell violently upon poor Tom, who stood shivering and dripping before him, but Mr. Allworthy intervened, calmly desiring the tutor to have patience. Turning to Master Blythill, he inquired, "Pray, child, what is the reason for all this disturbance?" Master Blythill answered with carefully measured words, "Indeed, uncle, I am profoundly sorry for what I have done. I have been unhappily the occasion of it all. I had Miss Sophia's bird in my hand, and thinking the poor creature languished for lack of liberty I own, I could not forbear giving it what it so clearly desired. For I have always thought there was something inherently cruel in confining any living thing. It seemed to contradict the fundamental law of nature, by which everything hath a natural right to freedom. Nay, it is even unchristian, for it violates the principle of doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. But if I had imagined Miss Sophia would have been so deeply concerned at it, I am sure I never would have done it, nor would I have proceeded had I known what would befall the bird itself. For when Master Jones, who climbed that tree in pursuit, fell into the water, the bird took a second flight, and presently a nasty hawk swooped down and carried it away forever. Who do you think bears more blame for the bird's fate? Blifil for freeing it, or Tom for climbing the tree? Comment your verdict below. Poor Sophia, who only now learned of her little Tommy's tragic fate, her concern for Jones having prevented her from noticing the hawk's attack, shed a sudden shower of tears. Mr. Allworthy endeavoured to assuage her grief, kindly promising her a much finer bird from the finest shop in London. But she declared passionately that she would never accept another, for no other bird could replace the one Tom had nurtured for her. Her father chided her for crying over what he called a foolish bird, but could not help telling young Blifil that if he were his son, his backside would be well and truly flayed for such a thoughtless act. Sophia now retired to her chamber, her heart doubly wounded by the loss of both her pet and Tom's safety. The two young gentlemen were sent home under clouded reputations, and the rest of the company returned to their bottle of port. There ensued a conversation about the bird's fate, so philosophically curious and morally complex that we believe it deserves a chapter entirely devoted to its examination. Square had no sooner lighted his long clay pipe, sending the first fragrant clouds of tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling, than he addressed himself to Allworthy with the deliberate gravity of a philosopher commencing a weighty discourse. Sir, he began, his voice taking on that measured tone he reserved for moral discussions, I cannot help but congratulate you most heartily upon the remarkable development of your nephew. Consider this at an age when few lads possess any ideas beyond those derived from sensible objects, mere physical appearances, and immediate gratifications. He has already arrived at the profound capacity to distinguish abstract right from wrong. His observation that to confine any creature seems contrary to the fundamental law of nature, by which everything possesses an inherent right to liberty. These were his very words, and the deep impression they have stamped upon my philosophical conscience is one never to be eradicated. Tell me, can any man possess a higher conception of the rule of right and the eternal fitness of things? I cannot help but promise myself from such a promising intellectual dawn that the meridian, the brilliant zenith of this youth's understanding will ultimately equal that of either the elder or younger Brutus, those paragons of Roman virtue. Here Thwackum hastily interrupted, his face flushing with immediate agitation. He spilled some of his wine in his emphatic gesture, swallowing the remainder with great eagerness before answering with sharp reproof. From another expression the boy employed, I sincerely hope he will resemble much better men than those pagan examples. This so-called law of nature you praise is merely a jargon of fashionable words, signifying nothing of substance. I know nothing of any such law, nor of any rights that can be derived from such a nebulous concept. However, his point about doing as we would be done by that, indeed, represents a properly Christian motive, as the boy well expressed himself, and I am genuinely glad to find that my careful instructions have borne such commendable fruit in his moral reasoning. If vanity were a sentiment fit for a philosopher to indulge, Square retorted with a slight superior smile, I might permit myself some small measure of it on this same occasion, for the source from which he can possibly have learnt his enlightened notions of right or wrong seems to me pretty apparent. Let me state this clearly. If there exists no law of nature, then there can be no meaningful foundation for right nor wrong whatsoever. How now? Exclaimed the parson, his eyes widening in theological alarm. Do you, then, banish holy revelation from your moral calculus? Tell me plainly, am I conversing with a deist or an atheist at this very table? Drink about, gentlemen, drink about, boomed Squire Weston, pounding the table in frustration. A pox on all your tedious laws of nature. Upon my soul, I don't know what either of you means, with all this talk of right and wrong. To take away my girl's bird was plainly wrong, in my plain opinion, and my neighbour Allworthy may do as he pleases with his own family, but to encourage boys in such troublesome practices is to breed them up directly for the gallows. Mark my words. Allworthy answered with his characteristic calm reasonableness that I am sincerely sorry for what my nephew has done, cannot be doubted, but I cannot consent to punish him severely when he acted rather from a generous, if misguided impulse, than from an unworthy motive. He continued thoughtfully, had the boy stolen the bird with malicious intent, none would have been more ready to vote for severe chastisement than myself, but it was plain to all that theft was not his design, and indeed it was as apparent to that good man as daylight that Blifil could have no other view than what he himself had so virtuously avowed. For as to that malicious purpose which Sophia's intuition had suspected, such a dark thought never once entered the pure unsuspecting head of Mr. Allworthy. He concluded once more by blaming the action as fundamentally inconsiderate, while maintaining it was pardonable only in one of such tender years. Who makes the more compelling argument, Square's philosophy or Thwackum's religion? Like this video, if you enjoy deep moral debates in literature, Square had delivered his philosophical opinion so openly and definitively that silence now would mean submitting to have his judgment publicly censured. He therefore responded with some intellectual warmth. Allworthy shows too much respect, if I may say so, to the dirty consideration of mere property. When we pass our judgments upon great and mighty moral actions, all such private regards should be laid completely aside. Remember, it is by adhering to those narrow conventional rules that the younger Brutus was condemned by shallow minds for ingratitude, and the elder for parricide, when both acted for the greater good of Rome, and if they had been hanged too. For those well-deserved crimes, cried Thwackum, his voice rising in righteous indignation. They would have received no more than their proper deserts, a couple of heathenish villains, I say. Heaven be praised, we have no such Brutuses. Novades. I wish, Mr. Square, you would desist from filling the impressionable minds of my pupils with such anti-Christian stuff, for the inevitable consequence must be, while they remain under my care, its being well scourged out of them again through proper discipline. There is your so-called disciple Tom, almost spoiled already by such notions. I overheard him just the other day disputing with Master Blifil that there was no genuine merit in faith without works. I know quite well. That is one of your favorite tenets, and I suppose he had it directly from you. Don't accuse me of spoiling him. Square shot back defensively. Who, pray tell, taught him to laugh at whatever is virtuous and decent and fit and right in the fundamental nature of things. He is primarily your own scholar, sir, and I disclaim him. No, Master Bliff, young as he is, that lad's clear notions of moral rectitude I defy you ever to eradicate with your narrow dogmas. Thwackum put on a contemptuous sneer at this declaration and replied with cutting sarcasm, Aye, I will gladly venture him with you. He is too well grounded in proper principles for all your philosophical cant to damage him. No, I have taken particular care to instill such sound principles into him, and I have instilled principles into him too, Square cried with equal passion. What but the sublime idea of virtue could possibly inspire a human mind with the generous thought of giving liberty to a captive creature? And I repeat to you again, if it was a fit thing for a philosopher to feel pride, I might legitimately claim the honor of having infused that noble idea into the boy's consciousness. And if pride was not forbidden by Scripture, Thwackum countered sharply, I might similarly boast of having taught him that very Christian duty which he himself assigned as his motive to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do you think Blifil acted from genuine virtue or hidden malice? Comment with your analysis below. So between you both roared the squire, his patience utterly exhausted. The young gentleman has been taught to rob my daughter of her bird. I find I must take better care of my partridge mew. At this rate, I shall have some virtuous religious man or other set all my partridges at liberty next. Then, slapping a gentleman of the law who was present heartily on the back, he cried out, What say you to this, Mr. Counsellor? Is not this against the law of the land, all this philosophical theft? The lawyer thus abruptly addressed adjusted his wig with great gravity and delivered himself with professional solemnity. If the case be put of a partridge, there can be no doubt but an action would lie in law. For though this bird be ferae naturae of a wild nature by classification, yet, being reclaimed and maintained, property vests in the owner. But this being the case of a mere singing bird, though similarly reclaimed, as it is a thing of base nature and minimal value, it must be considered as nullius in bonus, owned by no one in the eyes of sophisticated law. In this particular case, therefore, I conceive the plaintiff would necessarily be non-suited, and I should strongly disadvise the bringing of any such action, as it would inevitably fail upon legal examination. Well, grumbled the squire, thoroughly disgusted with this legal hair-splitting. If it be nullus bonus, as you say, then let us drink about and talk a little of the state of the nation or some other discourse that we all understand, for I am sure I don't understand a single word of this learned nonsense. It may be learning and sense for aught I know, but you shall never persuade me into believing it's anything but foolishness. Pox on all this philosophy. What vexes me most is that neither of you has mentioned a single word about that poor lad, Tom Jones, who alone deserves to be commended to venture. Breaking his neck to oblige my girl was a generous-spirited action, and I have learning enough to see that plain truth D.N. me. Here's Tom's health. I shall love the boy for it the longest day I have to live. Thus was the philosophical debate abruptly interrupted, but it would probably have been soon resumed with renewed vigor, had not Mr. Allworthy presently called for his coach with some urgency and carried off the two intellectual combatants before they could re-engage. Such was the conclusion of this memorable adventure of the bird and of the heated dialogue it occasioned, which we could not help recounting to our reader in its full complexity, though it happened some years before that particular stage or period of time at which our history is now arrived, for it illuminates the fundamental character differences that would shape all future events. Parva leves capiunt animos. Small things affect light minds, observed one of antiquity's great masters concerning the subtle passion of love, and most certain it is that from this pivotal day forward, Sophia began to nurture some little but growing kindness for Tom Jones in her heart, while developing an equally distinct aversion for his companion. This was not merely a passing fancy, but the first delicate awakening of an affection that would deepen with time and experience. Numerous small accidents and encounters from this time forward served to improve both these contrasting passions within her young breast. The reader possessing reasonable discernment may well conclude the natural progression of these feelings without our detailed recounting of every glance and conversation, especially considering what we have previously hinted regarding the fundamentally different tempers of these two lads, and recognizing how perfectly the one suited with her own natural inclinations, while the other consistently grated against them. To speak plain truth, Sophia, even at her tenderest age, possessed intuitive discernment enough to recognize that Tom, though universally acknowledged as an idle, thoughtless, rattling rascal, was ultimately nobody's enemy but his own, while she perceived with equal clarity that Master Blifil, though appearing as a prudent, discreet, sober young gentleman to the adult world, maintained at the same time a character strongly attached to the interest of only one single person. The identity of that particular person we shall allow the reader to divine without any further assistance from our narrative. These two distinct character types are not always received in the wider world with that different regard which seems so severally due to either, nor with that preferential treatment which one would imagine mankind acting from simple self-interest alone should naturally show toward the truly benevolent. But perhaps there exists a political reason for this curious social phenomenon in discovering a person of genuinely benevolent disposition. Worldly men may very reasonably suppose they have found a rare treasure and consequently feel desirous of keeping it, like all other precious things, exclusively to themselves. Hence they may imagine, perhaps unconsciously, that to trumpet forth the praises of such a person would, in the vulgar phrase, be equivalent to crying roast meat, and unnecessarily calling in partakers of what they intend to apply solely to their own advantage. If this reasoning does not fully satisfy the reader's curiosity, I know no other means of accounting for the little respect which I have commonly seen paid to a character which really does the greatest honour to human nature, and which proves most productive of the highest good to society at large. But it was decidedly otherwise with our Sophia. She honoured Tom Jones and scorned Master Blifil almost as soon as she understood the meaning of those two powerful words, recognizing moral essence where others saw only surface behaviour. Sophia had been absent upwards of 3 years, residing with her aunt, during all which time she had seldom encountered either of these young gentlemen. She dined, however, once during this period together with her aunt at Mr. Allworthy's hospitable table. This occurred a few days after the memorable partridge adventure we have previously commemorated. Sophia heard the entire story discussed at table, where she maintained a prudent silence throughout, nor indeed could her aunt extract many words from her during their return home. But later that evening, her maid, while undressing her, happened to remark casually, "Well, miss, I suppose you have seen young Master Blifil today?" She answered, with surprising passion, "I hate the very name of Master Blifil, as I do whatever is base and treacherous in human nature, and I wonder that Mr. Allworthy would suffer that old barbarous schoolmaster to punish a poor boy so cruelly for what was only the natural effect of his good nature." She then recounted the entire story to her attentive maid, and concluded by asking with genuine feeling, "Don't you think he is a boy of noble spirit? Are you Team Tom or Team Blifil-like for the charming rogue, comment for the prudent gentleman?" This accomplished young lady had now returned to her father's household, who gave her complete command of his domestic affairs, and placed her ceremoniously at the upper end of his table, where Tom, who for his great love of hunting had become a particular favourite of the squire, frequently dined. Young men of open, generous dispositions like Tom's are naturally inclined toward gallantry, which, when combined with good understanding, as was truly Tom's case, manifests itself in an obliging, complacent behaviour toward all women. In general, this quality greatly distinguished Tom from the boisterous brutality of mere country squires on one hand, and from the solemn, somewhat sullen deportment of Master Blifil on the other. By the age of 20, he began to acquire the reputation of a pretty fellow among all the women in the neighbourhood, though he remained charmingly unaware of this universal approbation. Tom behaved toward Sophia with no particular marked attention, unless perhaps by showing her a consistently higher respect than he paid to any other woman of his acquaintance. This distinction, her exceptional beauty, considerable fortune, evident sense, and amiable carriage seemed naturally to demand. But as to any specific design upon her person or affections, he entertained none whatsoever. For this apparent blindness, we shall at present suffer the reader to condemn him of remarkable stupidity, but perhaps in due course we shall be able indifferently well to account for this seeming neglect, revealing reasons not immediately apparent to casual observation. Sophia, while possessing the highest degree of innocence and modesty, maintained a remarkable native sprightliness in her general temper. This quality was so greatly increased whenever she found herself in Tom's company that had he not been very young and naturally thoughtless, he must have observed it. Or had Mr. Weston's thoughts not been generally either in the hunting field, the stable, or the dog kennel, the change in his daughter's manner might have perhaps created some paternal jealousy in him. But so far was the good gentleman from entertaining any such suspicions that he actually gave Tom every possible opportunity with his daughter which any aspiring lover could have wished. Tom innocently improved these opportunities to better advantage by following only the natural dictates of his gallantry and good nature than he might perhaps have done had he actually entertained the deepest designs upon the young lady. But indeed it can occasion little wonder that this subtle matter escaped the observation of others, since poor Sophia herself never consciously remarked the growing inclination of her own heart. That tender organ was irretrievably lost before she ever suspected it was in the slightest danger. Such is the cunning of Cupid's arrows. Matters stood precisely in this delicate situation when Tom, one fine afternoon, finding Sophia alone in the garden, began, after a short and awkward apology with a very serious countenance, to acquaint her that he had a particular favour to ask, which he desperately hoped her innate goodness would comply with, though neither the young man's general behaviour, nor indeed his somewhat grave manner of opening this business, could give her any just cause for suspecting he intended to make a declaration of love, yet whether nature whispered some premonition into her delicate ear, or from what other mysterious cause it arose, I will not determine. Certain it is that some idea of that momentous kind must have intruded itself upon her consciousness, for her vibrant colour immediately forsook her cheeks, her slender limbs trembled imperceptibly, and her tongue would have undoubtedly faltered had Tom stopped for an immediate answer. But he soon relieved her from this sweet perplexity by proceeding directly to inform her of his actual request. This was to solicit her influence on behalf of the unfortunate gamekeeper whose own ruin and that of his large and helpless family must be, he earnestly explained, the inevitable consequence of Mr. Weston's determined pursuit of legal action against him. Want to see how Sophia responds to Tom's request? Subscribe for the next chapter in their developing relationship. Sophia presently recovered her pleasant confusion, and with a smile full of captivating sweetness said, "Is this the mighty favour you asked with such solemn gravity? I will undertake it with all my heart. I truly pity the poor fellow, and no longer ago than yesterday sent a small token to his wife. This small matter consisted of one of her own gowns, several pieces of fine linen, and 10 shillings in money." Of this charitable act Tom had somehow heard, and it had in reality suggested this present solicitation to his resourceful mind. Our youth, now emboldened by his initial success, resolved to push the matter further, and even ventured to beg her recommendation of the gamekeeper to her father's permanent service. He protested with great earnestness that he considered him one of the honestest fellows in the entire county, and extremely well qualified for the place of a gamekeeper, which luckily then happened to be vacant. Sophia answered with charming graciousness, "Well, I will undertake this commission too, but I cannot promise you as much success in this latter part, though I assure you I will not quit my father's company without obtaining the first request. However, I will do everything in my power for the poor fellow, for I sincerely look upon him and his family as objects of genuine compassion. And now, Mr. Jones," she added with a slight blush, "I must ask a favor in return from you." "A favor, madam," cried Tom with immediate enthusiasm. "If you knew the profound pleasure you have given me merely in hoping to receive a command from you, you would understand that by mentioning it you confer the greatest possible favor upon me. For by this dear hand I would willingly sacrifice my life to oblige you." He then snatched her hand with impulsive warmth and eagerly kissed it, which marked the first time his lips had ever touched her skin. The blood which earlier had abandoned her cheeks now made her sufficient amends by rushing back over her face and neck with such violence that they became uniformly scarlet. She now first experienced a strange, delightful sensation to which she had been previously entirely unacquainted, and which, when she had sufficient leisure to reflect upon it, began to acquaint her with certain secrets of the heart, which the kind reader, if not already guessing them, will come to know in their proper time. Sophia, as soon as she could command her voice, which was not instantly, informed him that the favor she desired was that he would not lead her father through so many dangerous exploits during their hunting expeditions. She explained that from what she had heard reported, she suffered terrible fright every time they went out together and lived in constant expectation of seeing her father brought home with broken limbs some day. She therefore begged him for her sake to be more cautious, since he well knew Mr. Weston would follow wherever he led. She implored him not to ride so madly, nor to take those perilous leaps in the future. Tom promised faithfully to obey her commands, his heart swelling with pleasure at this evidence of her concern. After thanking her warmly for her kind compliance with his request, he took his leave, departing highly charmed with his successful negotiation. Poor Sophia was charmed too, but in a very different and more profound way. The precise nature of her sensations, however, the reader's own heart, if he or she possesses any sentimental sensibility, will better represent than any description of mine, even if I had as many mouths as ever poet wished for in his most extravagant fancy. It was Mr. Weston's established custom every afternoon, as soon as he was sufficiently drunk to hear his daughter play upon the harpsichord, for he considered himself a great lover of music, and perhaps, had he lived in London rather than the country, might have passed for a connoisseur among his peers. His critical taste always excepted against the finest compositions of Mr. Handel, whom he found too mathematical by half. He never relished any music but what was light and airy. Indeed, his most favourite tunes were decidedly Old Sir Simon the King Street, George He Was for England, Bobbing Joan, and some other popular ballads of similar character. His daughter, though she was a perfect mistress of music, and would never willingly have played anything but Handel's sublime compositions under different circumstances, remained so devoted to her father's pleasure that she, diligently learnt all his favoured tunes to oblige him. However, she would now and then gently endeavour to lead him into her own more refined taste. When he required the repetition of his beloved ballads for the third or fourth time, she would answer with a pleading, "Nay, dear sir," and would often beg him to suffer her to play something of superior quality. This particular evening, however, when the gentleman had retired from his bottle in unusually good spirits, she played all his favourites 3 times over without any solicitation whatsoever. This extraordinary compliance so pleased the good squire that he started suddenly from his couch, gave his daughter an approving kiss, and swore her musical hand had greatly improved since yesterday. She seized this perfect opportunity to execute her promise to Tom, in which she succeeded so well that the squire declared if she would give him t'other bout of old Sir Simon, he would give the gamekeeper his official deputation the very next morning. Accordingly, Sir Simon was played again and yet again till the familiar charms of the simple music soothed Mr. Western into a gentle and profound sleep. In the morning, Sophia did not fail to remind him of his engagement. His attorney was immediately sent for, ordered to stop any further proceedings in the action, and instructed to draw up the deputation without delay. Tom's success in this affair soon began to ring throughout the country, and various were the censures passed upon it. Some greatly applauded it as a commendable act of good nature, while others sneered, saying, "No wonder that one idle fellow should love another." Young Blifil was particularly enraged at this outcome. He had long hated Black George in the exact proportion as Jones delighted in him, not from any personal offence which he had ever received from the man, but from his great love to religion and virtue, for Black George had long maintained the reputation of being a loose kind of fellow in the neighbourhood. Blifil therefore represented Tom's intervention as flying directly in Mr. Allworthy's face, and declared with great concern that it was impossible to find any other motive for doing good to such a wretch than wilful defiance of proper authority. Thwackum and Square likewise sang to the same critical tune, though for different reasons. They were now, especially the latter, become greatly jealous of young Jones's influence with the wealthy widow, for he now approached the age of 20, had grown into a remarkably fine young fellow, and that lady by her marked encouragements to him seemed daily more and more to think him so. Allworthy, however, remained unmoved by their collective malice. He declared himself thoroughly satisfied with what Jones had accomplished. He said the perseverance and integrity of his friendship was highly commendable in one so young, and he expressed a sincere wish that he could see more frequent instances of that particular virtue in the world at large. But fortune, that fickle goddess, who seldom greatly relishes such honest sparks as my friend Tom, perhaps because they do not pay more ardent and constant addresses to her shrine, now gave a very different turn to all his actions. She prepared to show them to Mr. Allworthy in a light far less agreeable than that gentleman's inherent goodness had hitherto permitted him to see them, proving that even the most virtuous deeds may be twisted to appear vicious by circumstance and misrepresentation. I must acknowledge with some concern that there exist 2 distinct sorts of people who, I am afraid, have already conceived a certain measure of contempt for our hero based upon his recent behavior toward the admirable Sophia. The first category of critics will vehemently blame his apparent lack of prudence in neglecting what seemed a golden opportunity to possess himself of Mr. Weston's considerable fortune through marriage. The second category will no less despise him for what they perceive as inexplicable backwardness toward so fine a girl who appeared ready to fly into his waiting arms if only he would open them to receive her. Now, though I shall not perhaps be able absolutely to acquit him of either of these serious charges for want of proper prudence, generally admits of no convincing excuse, and what evidence I shall produce against the latter charge will I apprehend prove scarcely satisfactory to romantic minds, yet as mitigating circumstances may sometimes be offered in defense. I shall set forth the plain matter of fact as it truly occurred, and leave the final judgment to the reader's own determination and moral calculus. Mr. Jones possessed somewhat within his character which, though I think philosophical writers are not thoroughly agreed upon its precise name, certainly inhabits some human breasts. Its essential use is not so properly to distinguish abstract right from wrong through intellectual reasoning as to instinctively prompt and incite them toward the former, while simultaneously restraining and withholding them from the latter through what we might call moral intuition. This mysterious somewhat may indeed be usefully resembled to the famous trunk-maker who once occupied the upper gallery of the playhouse. For whenever the person who is possessed of this quality does what is morally right, no ravished or friendly spectator is so eager or so loud in his heartfelt applause. On the contrary, when the same person does wrong, no critic is so immediately apt to hiss and explode him with such visceral disapproval. To give a higher conception of the principle, I mean, to describe as well as one more familiar to our present age of legal sophistication, it may be considered as sitting upon its throne in the human mind, much like the Lord High Chancellor of this kingdom presides in his court. There it actively presides, governs, directs, judges, acquits, and condemns, according to strict merit and justice, possessing a knowledge which nothing escapes, a penetration which nothing can deceive and corrupt. This active moral principle may perhaps be said to constitute the most essential barrier between us and our neighbors, the brutes. For if there be some, in human shape, who appear not under any such moral dominion, I choose rather to consider them as deserters from our ranks to those of our inferior neighbors, among whom I might add they will likely share the fate of all deserters never being placed in the first rank of either society. Our hero, whether he derived this principle from the severe teachings of Thwackum or the philosophical instruction of Square, I will not determine, stood very strongly under the guidance of this internal moral compass. For though he did not always act rightly in every particular who among us does, yet he never did otherwise without feeling immediate and suffering for his transgressions. It was this principle which specifically taught him that to repay the civilities and little friendships of hospitality by robbing the very house where you have received them represents the basest and meanest category of theft. He did not think the baseness of this particular offense lessened by the height of the injury committed. On the contrary, if to steal another's silver plate deserved death and social infamy, It seemed to him difficult to assign any punishment adequate to the far greater crime of robbing a man of his whole fortune through deception and of his beloved child into the bargain. Do you believe Tom's moral compass is admirable or foolish? Like, if you respect his principles. Comment, if you think he's missing his chance. This governing principle therefore actively prevented him from any serious thought of making his fortune by such dishonorable means, for this, as I have said, represents an active principle, never contenting itself with mere knowledge or belief, without corresponding action. Had he been greatly enamored of Sophia at this juncture, he possibly might have thought otherwise about pursuing her. But give me leave to observe that there exists great difference between running away with a man's daughter from the genuine motive of love and doing the very same thing from the calculated motive of theft and financial improvement. Now, though this young gentleman was not insensible to the considerable charms of Sophia, though he greatly liked her exceptional beauty and esteemed all her other qualifications as beyond reproach, she had made, however, no deep impression on his heart thus far. For this apparent deficiency, as it renders him liable to the charge of stupidity, or at least of want of proper taste, we shall now proceed to account with complete transparency. The truth then must be told. His heart was already in the possession of another woman. Here, I question not but the reader will be profoundly surprised at our long taciturnity regarding this crucial matter, and quite at a loss to divine who this mysterious woman could possibly be, since we have hitherto not dropped the slightest hint of anyone likely to be considered a rival to Sophia's attractions. For as to Mrs. Blifil, though we have been obliged to mention some vague suspicions of her affection for Tom, we have not hitherto given the least latitude for imagining that he had any reciprocal affection for her. And indeed, I am sorry to say it, but the youth of both sexes are too apt to be deficient in their gratitude for that romantic regard with which persons more advanced in years are sometimes so unexpectedly kind to honor them, that the reader may be no longer held in unsatisfying suspense. He will be pleased to remember that we have often mentioned the family of George Seagrim, commonly called Black George, the gamekeeper, which consisted at present of a wife and 5 children, living in respectable poverty. The second of these children was a daughter whose name was Molly, and who was generally esteemed one of the handsomest girls in the whole county, despite her humble station. Congreve well says, "There is in true beauty something which vulgar souls cannot properly admire, so can no quantity of dirt or rags effectively hide this special quality from those souls which are not of the vulgar stamp." The developing beauty of this girl made, however, no particular impression on Tom's consciousness till she grew toward the age of 16, when Tom, who was near 3 years older, began first to cast the eyes of affection upon her, and this growing affection he had fixed on the girl long before he could bring himself to attempt the possession of her person. For though his vigorous constitution urged him greatly toward this consummation, his moral principles no less forcibly restrained him from taking advantage. To debauch a young woman, however low her social condition might appear, presented itself to him as a very heinous crime. The genuine goodwill he bore the father, combined with the sincere compassion he had for the entire family, very strongly corroborated all such sober reflections. So determined was he that he once resolved to get the better of his inclinations through sheer willpower, and he actually abstained 3 whole months without ever going to Seagrim's house, or so much as glimpsing his daughter during this period of self-denial. Now, though Molly was, as we have said, generally thought a very fine girl, and in reality she was so, yet her beauty was not of the most delicate, amiable kind that appeals to refined sensibilities. It had indeed very little of the feminine softness in it, and would have become a man at least as well as a woman. For to speak the plain truth, youth and florid health had a very considerable share in the composition of her attractions, rather than any particular grace or elegance. Nor was her mind more effeminate than her physical person. As her body was tall and robust, so was her disposition bold and forward in character. So little natural modesty did she possess, that Jones actually had more regard for her virtue than she herself demonstrated. And as most probably she liked Tom as well as he liked her, so when she perceived his puzzling backwardness, she herself grew proportionably forward in her encouragements. When she saw he had entirely deserted the house in his attempt at virtue, she found clever means of throwing herself repeatedly in his way, and behaved in such an obvious manner that the youth must have had very much of the hero, or very little of the man in him if her determined endeavours had proved ultimately unsuccessful. In a word, she soon triumphed over all the virtuous resolutions of poor Jones. For though she behaved at last with all decent reluctance required by convention, yet I rather choose to attribute the triumph principally to her, since in sober fact it was her deliberate design which succeeded where his resistance failed. Who do you think bears more responsibility for their relationship, Tom or Molly? Share your perspective in the comments. In the conduct of this delicate matter, I say Molly so well played her assigned part that Jones attributed the conquest entirely to himself and his own irresistible attractions. He considered the young woman as one who had merely yielded to the violent attacks of his passion against her better judgment. He likewise imputed her yielding to the ungovernable force of her love towards him, and this the reader will allow to have been a very natural and probable supposition for a young man to make, as we have more than once mentioned the uncommon comeliness of his person, and indeed he was one of the handsomest young fellows in the world, so such an assumption came readily to him. As there are some minds whose affections, like Master Blifil's, are solely placed on one single person, whose interest and indulgence alone they consider on every occasion, regarding the good and ill of all others as merely indifferent, except in so far as they contribute to the pleasure or advantage of that favoured person. So there exists a different temper of mind, which borrows a degree of virtue even from self-love itself. Such persons can never receive any kind of satisfaction from another without loving the creature to whom that satisfaction is owing, and without making that person's well-being in some sort necessary to their own ease and peace of mind. Of this latter species was decidedly our hero. He considered this poor girl as one whose happiness or misery he had personally caused to be dependent on himself through their intimacy, Her beauty remained still the object of desire, though greater beauty or a fresher object might have been more so from a purely physical perspective. But the little abatement which fruition had occasioned to this desire was highly overbalanced by the considerations of the affection which she visibly bore him, and of the precarious situation into which he had brought her through their liaison. The former of these circumstances created genuine gratitude, the latter sincere compassion. Both sentiments, together with his residual desire for her person, raised in him a passion which might without any great violence to the word be called love, though perhaps it was at first not very judiciously placed in its object. This, then, was the true reason of that apparent insensibility which he had shown to the superior charms of Sophia, and that perplexing behavior in her presence, which might have been reasonably enough interpreted as encouragement to his addresses. For as he could not think of abandoning his Molly poor and destitute as she was, so no more could he entertain a notion of betraying such an exceptional creature as Sophia with dishonest intentions. And surely had he given the least encouragement to any passion for that superior young lady while engaged elsewhere, he must have been absolutely guilty of one or other of those crimes against honor, either of which would, in my considered opinion, have very justly subjected him to that tragic fate which at his first introduction into this history I mentioned to have been generally predicted by the cynical as his certain destiny. It was her mother who first perceived the subtle but unmistakable alteration in Molly's figure, a change that grew more pronounced with each passing week. In a desperate attempt to conceal this developing situation from the prying eyes of her neighbors, she committed the foolish error of dressing her daughter in that very same elegant sack which the benevolent Sophia had sent as charity, though in truth that kind-hearted young lady had never apprehended that the poor woman would prove weak-minded enough to permit any of her daughters to wear the garment in such a conspicuous and revealing manner. Molly, for her part, felt utterly charmed with this first genuine opportunity she had ever possessed to display her beauty to its fullest advantage. For though she could quite comfortably contemplate her own reflection in the looking-glass, even when attired in rags and tatters, and though she had, while wearing such humble dress, successfully conquered the heart of Jones, and perhaps those of several other young men in the vicinity, she nevertheless believed that the addition of proper finery would dramatically improve her natural charms and considerably extend her sphere of romantic conquests. Do you think Molly's ambition is admirable or reckless? Like, if you appreciate her confidence, comment if you see trouble ahead. Molly, therefore, having arrayed herself splendidly in this fashionable sack, complemented by a new, delicately laced cap and several other ornamental trinkets, which Tom had previously given her as tokens of affection, made her ceremonious way to church with a delicate fan held gracefully in her hand the very next Sunday. The great and powerful of this world are profoundly deceived if they imagine they have exclusively appropriated human ambition and personal vanity to themselves alone. These so-called noble qualities flourish just as notably within the humble confines of a country church and its adjoining churchyard, as they do in the most elegant drawing room or the most private closet of the aristocracy. Schemes of considerable complexity have indeed been laid within the vestry that would hardly disgrace the most secretive papal conclave. Here exists a functioning ministry, and here stands an organized opposition. Here one finds intricate plots and clever circumventions, competing parties, and bitter factions, fully equal in intensity to those which might be discovered in royal courts. Nor are the women who congregate here any less practiced in the highest feminine arts than their fair superiors in quality and fortune. Here one observes calculating prudes and artful coquettes in equal measure. Here unfolds the elaborate theatre of meticulous dressing and strategic ogling, of whispered falsehoods, simmering envy, concealed malice, and delicious scandal. In short, everything which commonly characterizes the most splendid aristocratic assembly or the most polished polite circle. Let those of high life therefore no longer condescend to despise the presumed ignorance of their social inferiors, nor let the vulgar any longer waste breath railing exclusively against the vices of their supposed betters, for human nature proves remarkably consistent across all social strata. Molly had seated herself demurely in the family pew for some considerable time before she was finally recognized by her curious neighbors. Then a ripple of whispers moved through the entire congregation like a sudden wind through wheat fields, with the same question passing from lips to ear: "Who is that fine lady?" But when her true identity was discovered, such unrestrained sneering, such giggling, such tittering, and such open laughter ensued among the women of the congregation that the venerable Mr. Allworthy found himself obliged to exert his considerable moral authority to preserve any semblance of decency and order among them. The sacred atmosphere of the church, normally reserved for quiet contemplation, now crackled with a different kind of energy, a mixture of shock, judgment, and barely concealed excitement at this breach of social protocol. All eyes turned toward Molly, who sat with a mixture of pride and defiance, as if challenging the entire community to deny her this moment of glorious visibility, fully aware of the storm she had deliberately walked into, yet seemingly exhilarated by the attention she commanded. Mr. Weston maintained a considerable estate within this very parish, and as his manor house stood at little greater distance from this particular church than from his own local chapel, he very often favoured the congregation with his presence at divine service here. Both he and the charming Sophia happened to be present at this precise tumultuous time, witnessing the extraordinary spectacle unfolding before them. Sophia found herself much pleased with the natural beauty of the girl, though she simultaneously pitied her for the sheer simplicity in having dressed herself in such an ostentatious manner. With her keen perception, Sophia immediately recognized the bitter envy it had occasioned among Molly's social equals. So moved was she by this combination of admiration and compassion that no sooner had she returned home than she immediately sent for the gamekeeper, ordering him, in no uncertain terms, to bring his daughter to her presence at once. She declared with firm benevolence that she would provide for the girl within her own household, and might possibly place her about her own person as an attendant, especially since her current maid was preparing to depart from her service. Poor Seagrim felt absolutely thunderstruck at this unexpected proposition, for he remained no stranger to the particular fault currently developing in his daughter's physical shape. He answered in a stammering, hesitant voice that "I'm afraid Molly would be too awkward and unpolished to wait upon your ladyship properly, as she hath never been in formal service before." "No matter for that," says Sophia with determined kindness. "She will soon improve with proper instruction. I find myself pleased with the girl's spirit, and am thoroughly resolved to try her capabilities. Black George now hastily repaired to his wife, upon whose prudent counsel he heavily depended to extricate him from this increasingly complicated dilemma. But when he arrived at his humble dwelling, he found the household in utter confusion and disarray. So great had been the envy which the fashionable sack occasioned, that when Mr. Allworthy and the other gentry had departed from the church, the rage which had hitherto been somewhat contained burst forth into open uproar, having vented itself initially through opprobrious words, mocking laughs, derisive hisses, and vulgar gestures. The mob's fury eventually betook itself to certain missile weapons of organic nature. These, though from their soft and plastic composition, threatened neither the loss of life nor of limb, nevertheless proved sufficiently dreadful to any well-dressed lady of refinement. Molly possessed far too much native spirit to bear this humiliating treatment tamely. Having therefore but hold, as we remain diffident of our own narrative abilities to properly capture such a scene, let us here respectfully invite a superior power to our assistance. Who do you think wins this battle of wits and wills, like for Molly's spirit? Comment for the village women's traditional values, ye muses. Then whoever ye are who particularly love to sing of epic battles, and principally thou who, whilom didst recount the glorious slaughter in those fields where Hudibras and Trulla fought so valiantly, if thou wert not starved alongside thy friend Butler. Assist me now on this great occasion of describing feminine combat, for all things are not in the power of all writers, and this scene requires more than mortal pen, as a vast herd of cows in a rich farmer's yard. If, while they are being milked, they hear their calves at a distance, lamenting the robbery, then being committed upon them, begin to roar and bellow in sympathetic outrage. So roared forth the Somersetshire mob, a tremendous hallelujah made up of almost as many squalls, screams, and other different sounds as there were persons, or indeed as there were passions, stirring among them. Some were inspired by pure rage, others were alarmed by genuine fear, and still others had nothing in their heads but the love of mischief and fun, but chiefly envy the sinister sister of Satan, and his constant companion rushed invisibly among the crowd, blowing up the fury of the women to fever pitch. These women no sooner advanced upon Molly than they began pelting her with dirt and miscellaneous rubbish collected from the churchyard. Molly, having endeavoured in vain to make a handsome strategic retreat, suddenly faced about with determined courage, laying hold of Ragged Bess, who advanced boldly in the front ranks of the enemy. She, with one mighty blow, felled her to the ground. The whole army of the enemy, though near 100 in number, seeing the fate of their general, gave back many paces and retired behind a new-dug grave for the churchyard, served as the field of battle, where a funeral was scheduled for. That very evening, Molly pursued her victory with relentless vigour, catching up a weathered skull which lay beside the grave, and discharging it with such fury that, having hit a tailor directly on the head, the two skulls sent forth equally hollow sounds at their meeting. The tailor immediately took measure of his length upon the ground where the skulls lay side by side, and it became doubtful which of the two possessed the greater intrinsic value. Molly then, seizing a thigh bone in her hand, fell in among the flying ranks dealing her blows with great liberality on either side, and overthrew the carcasses of many a mighty hero and heroine who had dared oppose her. Recount, O Muse, the names of those who fell on this fatal day. First Jemmy Tweedle felt upon his hinder head the direful bone. Him the pleasant banks of sweetly winding Stour had nourished from infancy, where he first learned the vocal art with which, wandering up and down at wakes and fairs, he cheerfully entertained the rural nymphs and swains, when upon the Bind's village green they interweaved the sprightly dance, while he himself stood fiddling and jumping to his own merry music. How little now avails his beloved fiddle! He thumps the verdant floor with his own carcass. Next old Etchapole, the sow gelder, received a mighty blow directly in his forehead from our Amazonian heroine, and immediately fell to the ground. He was a swinging fat fellow of considerable bulk, and fell with almost as much noise as a collapsing house. His brass tobacco box dropped simultaneously from his pocket, which Molly promptly took up as lawful spoils of war. Then Kate of the Mill tumbled unfortunately over a moss-covered tombstone, which, catching hold of her ungartered stocking, inverted the very order of nature, giving her heels unwelcome superiority over her head. Betty Pippin, together with young Roger, her lover, fell both together to the ground, where, O perverse fate, she salutes the earth while he simultaneously salutes the sky. Tom Freckle, the smith's son, became the next victim to her righteous rage. He was an ingenious workman known for making excellent patterns. Nay, the very pattern with which he was knocked down proved to be his own workmanship. Had he been, at that time, singing psalms safely inside the church, he would have certainly avoided a broken head. Miss Crow, the daughter of a prosperous farmer, John Giddish himself, a farmer of some reputation, Nan Slouch, Esther Codling, Will Spray, Tom Bennett, the three Mrs. Potter, whose father keeps the sign of the Red Lion, Betty Chambermaid, Jack Ostler, and many others of inferior note, lay variously rolling among the ancient graves. Not that the strenuous arm of Molly physically reached all these combatants, for many of them, in their panicked flight, overthrew each other in their confusion. But now Fortune, fearing she had acted out of character and had inclined too long to the same side, especially as it was the right side, hastily turned about. For now entered Goody Brown, whom Ezekiel Brown caressed in his arms regularly, nor he alone but half the parish. Besides, so famous was she in the fields of Venus, nor indeed less renowned in those of Mars. The trophies of both these arenas her husband always bore about prominently on his head and face. For if ever human head did, by its horns, display the amorous glories of a wife, Ezekiel's did most conspicuously, nor did his well-scratched face less denote her talents, or rather talons of a different, more violent. No longer could this seasoned Amazon bear the shameful flight of her party. She stopped short in her tracks, and calling aloud to all who fled, spoke as follows: Ye Somersetshire men, or rather, ye Somersetshire women, are ye not thoroughly ashamed thus to fly from a single woman? But if no other will oppose her, I myself, and Joan Top here, will have the honour of achieving the victory. Having thus declared, she flew at Molly Seagrim with terrifying speed, easily wrenching the thigh bone from her hand, while simultaneously clawing off her cap from her head. Then, laying hold of Molly's hair with her left hand, she attacked her so furiously in the face with her right that the blood soon began to trickle in crimson streams from Molly's nose. Molly was not idle during this assault. She soon removed the protective clout from the head of Goody Brown, and then fastening on her adversary's hair with one hand with the other, she caused another bloody stream to issue forth from the nostrils of her enemy. How do you think this dramatic confrontation will end? Subscribe to follow Molly's tumultuous journey. When each of the determined combatants had borne off sufficient spoils of hair from the head of her antagonist, their next rage turned violently against each other's garments. In this sartorial attack they exerted so much destructive violence that in very few minutes they were both naked to the middle, their modesty sacrificed to their fury. It proves fortunate for women everywhere that the primary seat of fisticuff warfare is not the same with them as among men. For though they may seem to deviate somewhat from their expected sex when they go forth to battle, yet I have carefully observed they never so far forget themselves as to assail the bosoms of each other, where a few well-placed blows would undoubtedly prove fatal to most of them. This restraint, I know some cynical observers derive from women being of a more naturally bloody inclination than males, which account they apply to the nose as the part from which blood may most easily be drawn. But this seems a far-fetched, as well as decidedly ill-natured supposition, lacking in both evidence and charity. Goody Brown held great advantage over Molly in this particular aspect, for the former had indeed no prominent breasts to speak of. Her bosom, if it may be so called, as well in colour as in many other properties, exactly resembled an ancient piece of parchment upon which anyone might have drummed a considerable while without doing her any great damage. Molly, beside her present unhappy condition, was quite differently formed in those particular parts, and might perhaps have tempted the envy of Goody Brown to give her a fatal blow, had not the lucky arrival of Tom Jones at this precise instant put an immediate end to the bloody scene. This timely accident was luckily owing to Mr. Square's peculiarity, for he, Master Bliffle and Jones, had mounted their horses after church services to take the morning air. They had ridden about a quarter of a mile when Square, suddenly changing his mind, not idly, but for a reason which we shall unfold as soon as we have sufficient leisure, desired the young gentleman to ride with him another way than they had at first purposed. This motion being complied with, brought them of necessity back again to the churchyard where the battle raged. Master Blifil, who rode first, seeing such a considerable mob assembled, and two women in the posture in which we left the combatants, stopped his horse to inquire with aristocratic detachment what was the matter. A country fellow, scratching his head in confusion, answered him, "I don't know, measter, I, and please your honour, here hath been a fight, I think, between Goody Brown and Moll Seagrim." Who cries Tom, with immediate alarm, but without waiting for a proper answer, having discovered the familiar features of his Molly through all the discomposure in which they now were, he hastily alighted from his horse, turned the animal loose, and leaping over the stone wall ran to her assistance. She now first burst into relieving tears, telling him between sobs how barbarously she had been treated. Upon hearing this account, forgetting the sex of Goody Brown in his protective rage, or perhaps not knowing it in the heat of the moment, for in reality she had no particularly feminine appearance, beyond the petticoat which he might not have immediately observed, he gave her a lash or two with his horsewhip. Then, flying at the mob, all of whom were vehemently accused by the weeping mole, he dealt his blows so profusely on all sides that unless I would again invoke the muse, which the good-natured reader may think a little too hard upon her, as she hath so lately been violently sweated in describing the previous combat, it would be utterly impossible for me to properly recount the comprehensive horse-whipping of that memorable day. Having scoured the whole coast of the enemy as thoroughly as any of Homer's heroes ever did, or as Don Quixote or any knight-errant in the world could have done, he returned to Molly. He found her in a condition which must give both me and my reader considerable pain were it to be described here in all its distressing detail. Tom raved like a madman, beat his breast in anguish, tore his hair in frustration, stamped violently upon the ground, and vowed the utmost vengeance upon all who had been concerned in her mistreatment. He then tenderly pulled off his own coat and buttoned it carefully around her, placed his hat gently upon her head, wiped the blood from her face as well as he could with his handkerchief, and called out to the servant to ride as fast as possible to fetch a side saddle or a pillion, that he might carry her safe home without further humiliation. Master Blifil objected to sending away the servant, as they had only one attendant with them. But as Square unexpectedly seconded the order of Jones, he was obliged to comply despite his misgivings. The servant returned in a very short time with the requested pillion, and Molly, having collected her torn rags as well as she could manage, was placed behind him with great care. In this manner she was carried safely home, with Square Blifil and Jones solemnly attending the procession. Here, Jones, having received his coat back, given her a sly kiss of reassurance, and whispered promisingly that he would return to visit her that evening, finally quitted his beloved Molly and rode on after his companions, his heart heavy with concern, and his mind troubled by the day's tumultuous events. Molly had no sooner reapparelled herself in her accustomed rags, the fine sack, now lying torn and soiled in a corner like a discarded dream, than her sisters began to fall upon her with violent verbal assaults. The air in their cramped dwelling grew thick with resentment and jealousy, each word striking with the sharpness of physical blows. Her eldest sister led the charge, her voice dripping with bitter satisfaction as she declared, "You were well enough served for your vanity and pride. How had you the brazen assurance to wear a gown which young Madam Weston had given specifically to our mother, if any one of us was to wear such a fine garment?" I think she continued, drawing herself up with self-righteous indignation. "I myself have the best right as the eldest, but I warrant you thought it belonged to your beauty alone. I suppose you fancy yourself more handsomer than any of us, with your fine airs and gentlemen admirers." "Hand her down the bit of glass from over the cupboard," cried another sister with malicious glee, "so she might see herself clearly. I'd wash the blood and dirt from my face before I dared talk of my beauty in such a state. You'd better have minded what the parson says in his sermons," cried the eldest, her voice rising to a shrill pitch, "and not have hearkened after men voke, throwing yourself at any fellow who glances your way. Indeed, child." And so she had says, the mother sobbing into her apron, her shoulders shaking with genuine distress. "She hath brought a disgrace upon us, all she has. She's the worst of the family that ever was a whore, and now the whole parish knows it." Do you think Molly's family is being unfair? Like, if you sympathize with Molly. Comment, if you side with her family. You need not upbraid me with that, mother, cried Molly, her eyes flashing with defiant anger, her body trembling not from fear, but from righteous fury. You yourself was brought to bed of sister there within a mere week after you was married. So let's not pretend our family has always followed the straight path. Yes, hussy, answered the enraged mother, her face flushing crimson with shame and anger. So I was, and what was the mighty matter of that? I was made an honest woman, then by the wedding ring, and if you was to be made an honest woman properly, I should not be angry with you. But you must needs have to doing with a gentleman, you nasty slut. You will have a bastard hussy. You will. And that I defy anyone to say of me, for all my children were born in holy wedlock. In this tumultuous situation, Black George found his family when he came home for the purpose previously mentioned. The small cottage echoed with the sounds of female strife, a cacophony of accusations and weeping, as his wife and 3 daughters were all talking together in heated tones, and most of them crying with either rage or self-pity. It was some time before he could get an opportunity of making himself heard above the din, but as soon as such a precious interval occurred in the storm, he acquainted the company with what Sophia had said to him, his words stumbling out in his anxiety. Goody Seagrim then began to revile her daughter afresh, turning her wrath in a new direction. "Here," says she, waving her arms dramatically, "you have brought us into a fine quandary. Indeed, what will the young madam say when she sees that big belly of yours? Oh, that ever I should live to see this day of shame and humiliation." Molly answered with great spirit, her chin lifted in defiance. "And what is this mighty place which you have got for me, father?" For he had not well understood the elegant phrase used by Sophia about Molly being about her person. "I suppose it is to be under the cook in the kitchens, but I shan't wash dishes for anybody, not I. My gentleman will provide better for me than that. See what he hath given me this very afternoon." And so saying, she pulled out several golden guineas from her secret pocket, the coins catching the dim light of the cottage, and gave her mother one of them with a flourish. The good woman no sooner felt the solid gold within her palm than her temper began. Such is the miraculous efficacy of that universal panacea to be noticeably mollified. The gold seemed to work a strange alchemy on her spirits, transforming outrage into calculation. "Why," husband says, she, her voice, now several degrees softer, "would any but such a blockhead as you not have inquired what place this was before he had accepted it? Perhaps, as Molly says, it may be in the kitchen, and truly I don't care for my daughter being a scullion wench, for poor as I am a gentlewoman by upbringing, and though I was obliged as my father, who was a clergyman, mind you, died worse than nothing, and so could not give me a shilling of portion to undervalue myself by marrying a poor man, yet I would have you to know I have a spirit above all them things. Marry, come up, it would better become Madam Weston to look at home, and remember who her own grandfather was. Some of my family, for aught I know, might ride in their coaches when the grandfathers of some folk walked avoot. I warrant she fancies she did a mighty matter when she sent us that old gownd. Some of my family would not have picked up such rags in the street, But poor people are always trampled upon. The parish need not have been in such a fluster with Molly. You might have told them, child, your grandmother wore better things, knew out of the shop, and thought nothing of it. Want to see how this family drama unfolds? Subscribe for more classic literature brought to life. Well, but consider, cried George, scratching his head in bewilderment at this sudden change in his wife's demeanor. What answer shall I make to the young madam? She expects an answer, and we must give her one that suits. I don't know what answer says, she beginning to revert to her querulous tone. You are always bringing your family into one quandary or another with your foolishness. Do you remember when you shot the partridge, the occasion of all our misfortunes? Did not I advise you never to go into Squire Weston's manor? Did not I tell you many a good year ago what would come of it? But you would have your own headstrong ways. Yes, you would, you villain. Black George was in the main a peaceable kind of fellow, and nothing choleric nor rash. Yet did he bear about him something of what the ancients called the irascible, and which his wife, if she had been endowed with much wisdom, would have learned to fear. He had long experience that when the domestic storm grew very high, arguments were but wind, which served rather to increase than to abate the tempest. He was therefore seldom unprovided with a small switch, a remedy of wonderful force, as he had often essayed in the past, and which the word villain now served as a hint for his immediately applying. No sooner therefore had this symptomatic word escaped her lips than he had immediate recourse to the said remedy, which, though as it is usual in all very efficacious medicines, it at first seemed to heighten and inflame the disease, with shrieks and protests, soon produced a total calm, and restored the patient to perfect ease and tranquillity, if not genuine contentment. This is, however, a kind of horse medicine, which requires a very robust constitution to digest, and is therefore proper only for the vulgar ranks of society, unless in one single instance, viz., where superiority of birth breaks out in vulgar manners, in which case we should not think it very improperly applied by any husband whatever, if the application was not in itself so base that, like certain applications of the physical kind which need not be mentioned, it so much degrades and contaminates the hand employed in it, that no true gentleman should endure the thought of anything so low and detestable. The whole family was soon reduced to a state of perfect quiet, for the virtue of this medicine, like that of electricity, is often communicated through one person to many others who are not directly touched by the instrument. To say the truth, as they both operate by friction, it may be doubted whether there is not something analogous between them of which Mr. Freak would do well to inquire before he publishes the next edition of his book on electrical phenomena. A council was now called in the subdued atmosphere in which, after many debates, Molly still persisting with stubborn pride that she would not go to service, as a common maid, it was at length resolved that Goody Seagrim herself should wait upon Miss Weston, and endeavour to procure the place for her eldest daughter, who declared great readiness to accept it, seeing the advantage of regular wages and a full stomach. But Fortune, who seems to have been a particular enemy of this little family afterwards, put a stop to her promotion through a series of unforeseen circumstances, proving once again that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry when destiny intervenes. The next morning dawned bright and clear, finding Tom Jones engaged in vigorous hunting with the enthusiastic Mr. Weston across his vast estates. The crisp autumn air rang with the sounding of horns and the baying of hounds as they pursued their quarry through fields and woodlands. At their triumphant return, flushed with the success of their sport, Tom found himself warmly invited by the squire to remain for dinner, an invitation he accepted with genuine pleasure, though with a heart increasingly troubled by conflicting emotions. The lovely Sophia shone forth that day with more brilliant gaiety and infectious sprightliness than usual. Her entire demeanor seemed illuminated from within, her laughter ringing like silver bells through the great hall. Unbeknownst even to herself, her battery of charms was certainly being levelled at our hero with increasing precision, though I verily believe the young lady herself scarce yet understood her own intentions or recognized the growing warmth of her affections. But if she harbored any unconscious design of captivating him completely, she now succeeded beyond her wildest imaginations, for Tom found himself repeatedly catching his breath at her radiance. Mr. Supple, the respectable curate of Mr. Allworthy's parish, made one of the company at dinner that evening. He was a good-natured, worthy man of comfortable proportions, but chiefly remarkable for his great taciturnity at table, though his mouth was never actually shut, during the meal being constantly occupied with its solemn duty. In short, he possessed one of the most determined and admirable appetites in the world, approaching each course with reverential focus. However, the cloth was no sooner taken away than he always made sufficient amends for his previous silence, for he proved a very hearty fellow, once liberated from culinary distractions. His conversation, while never offensive, often proved surprisingly entertaining in its detailed accounts of parish affairs. At his first arrival, which occurred immediately before the magnificent entrance of the roast beef borne aloft by two servants, he had given a vague intimation that he had brought some news of interest with him. He was beginning to tell the company that he came that very moment from Mr. Allworthy's household when the splendid sight of the roast beef struck him temporarily dumb, permitting him only to murmur a hasty grace and to declare he must pay his immediate respects to the baronet for, so he ceremoniously called the massive sirloin, as if it were nobility itself. Are you enjoying the romantic tension between Tom and Sophia? Like this video if you're shipping this classic couple. When dinner was finally over, being reminded by the curious Sophia of his promised news, he began as follows, with great solemnity. I believe, my lady, your ladyship may have observed a certain young woman at church yesterday during evensong, who was dressed most conspicuously in one of your own outlandish garments. I think I have seen your ladyship appear in such a one yourself. However, in our simple country, such fashionable dresses are, as the poet says, rara avis in terris negro similima signo. That is, madam, as much as to say, a rare bird upon the earth, and very like a black swan. The verse originates from Juvenal, the Roman satirist. But to return to what I was relating, I was observing that such garments are rare sights indeed in the countryside, and perchance, too, It was thought the more rare, particular respect being had to the person who wore it, who they inform me is the daughter of Black George, your worship's own gamekeeper. One might have thought the man's recent sufferings might have taught him more wisdom than to dress forth his wenches in such gaudy apparel, inviting the notice of the entire parish. She created so much confusion in the congregation that if Squire Allworthy himself had not silenced it with considerable authority, it would have interrupted the divine service entirely. Indeed, I was once compelled to stop in the very middle of the first lesson until order was restored. Howbeit, nevertheless, after prayers were concluded and I had departed for home, this unfortunate incident occasioned a most unseemly battle in the churchyard, where, amongst other mischief, the head of a travelling fiddler was very much broken by a flying skull. This morning the said fiddler came to Squire Allworthy seeking a warrant, and the wench was brought before him for judgment. The squire was initially inclined to have compounded matters with a mild reprimand, when lo, on a sudden the wench appeared. I ask your ladyship's pardon for the indelicacy to be, as it were, at the very eve of bringing forth a bastard. The squire demanded of her most sternly who was the father, but she pertinaciously refused to make any response whatsoever, remaining obstinate as a mule, so that he was about to make her mittimus to Bridewell for her defiance when I departed. And is a wench having a bastard all your news, Doctor, cries Weston with a snort of disappointment. I thought it might have been some matter of public importance, something concerning the nation or the markets. I am afraid it is too common indeed in these troubled times, answered the parson with a sorrowful shake of his head. But I thought the whole story altogether deserved commemorating for its exemplary moral. As to national matters, your worship knows them far better than I. My humble concerns extend no farther than the boundaries of my own parish, where such scandals affect us most directly. Why, I, says the squire, puffing out his chest slightly, I believe I do know a little of that matter, as you say. But come, Tommy, drink about, man. The bottle stands with you, and we'll have no shirkers at this table. Tom begged to be excused, claiming that he had particular business requiring his immediate attention. Getting up from the table with uncharacteristic haste, he just escaped the clutches of the squire, who was already rising to stop him, and went off with very little ceremony, his departure so abrupt it raised eyebrows around the table. The squire gave him a good curse at his departure, invoking several creative oaths. Then turning to the parson with a knowing look, he cried out, I smoke it. I smoke the truth of it. Now Tom is certainly the father of this bastard. Zooks, parson, you remember how he recommended the veather of her to me so insistently. D-N, what a sly she is. I, as sure as 2 pence, Tom is the veather of the bastard, says the parson, his face clouding with genuine concern. Why, sorry, cries the squire, genuinely perplexed. Where is the mighty matter of it? What? I suppose you pretend that you yourself have never got a bastard pox. More good luck's yours then, for I warrant you've done her therefore many's the good time, and often Your worship is pleased to be jocular, answered the parson, colouring slightly at the accusation. But I do not only animadvert on the sinfulness of the action, though that surely is to be greatly deprecated, but I fear his unrighteousness may seriously injure him in Mr. Allworthy's estimable opinion. And truly I must say, though he hath the character of being a little wild among the villagers, I never saw any real harm in the young man, nor can I say I have heard any substantial evil of him, save what your worship now mentions. I wish indeed he was a little more regular in his responses at church service, but altogether he seems to me, as the ancients would say, ingenui vultus puer, ingenuique pudoris. That is a classical line, young lady, he added, turning to Sophia, and being rendered into plain English means a lad of an ingenuous countenance and of an ingenuous modesty. For this was a virtue in great repute both among the Latins and Greeks. I assure you, I must say the young gentleman, for so I think I may properly call him, notwithstanding the circumstances of his birth, appears to me a very modest, civil lad, and I should be truly sorry that he should do himself any injury in Squire Allworthy's valued opinion. Poog, says the squire, waving a dismissive hand, injury with Allworthy. Why, Allworthy loves a wench himself. Doth not all the country know whose son Tom is? You must talk to another person in that moralizing manner. I remember Allworthy at college, and he was no saint then, I thought, said the parson, cautiously, that he had never been at the university according to common knowledge. Yes, he was, says the squire with a wicked chuckle, and many a wench have we two had together in our youth. He was as arrant a whoremaster as any within 5 miles of him. No, it will do him no harm with Allworthy, assure yourself, nor with anybody else of sense. Ask Sophie there, turning suddenly to his daughter. You have not the worse opinion of a young fellow for getting a bastard, have you, girl? No, the women will like him the better, for it, in my experience, shows he's a proper man. Do you think Tom should own up to his responsibility? Comment with your advice for our hero. This was a particularly cruel question to poor Sophia, delivered with her father's characteristic lack of sensitivity. She had observed Tom's colour change dramatically during the parson's story, and that telling reaction, combined with his hasty and abrupt departure, gave her sufficient reason to fear her father's suspicion was not groundless. Her heart now discovered the great secret to her all at once. The secret it had been so gradually disclosing by little and little, through stolen glances and growing attachment. She found herself intensely interested in this matter, her spirit torn between disappointment and protective concern. In such a vulnerable situation, her father's malapert question rushing suddenly upon her produced some visible symptoms which might have alarmed a more suspicious heart than Weston's. But to do the bluff squire justice, that particular sensitivity was not among his faults. When she rose therefore from her chair with dignity, and told him a hint from him was always sufficient to make her withdraw from indelicacy, he suffered her to leave the room without question. Then, with great gravity of countenance, he remarked to the parson that it was better to see a daughter over-modest than over-forward, a sentiment which was highly applauded by the pious parson, who saw in it evidence of proper upbringing. There now ensued between the squire and the parson a most excellent political discourse, framed largely out of newspapers and political pamphlets, the squire had half read, in which they made a libation of 4 full bottles of wine to the good of their country, solving various national crises between toasts. Then the squire, being fast asleep in his great chair, the parson quietly lighted his pipe, mounted his patient horse, and rode home through the gathering twilight, his head buzzing with politics and port. When the squire had finished his customary half-hour's nap, he summoned his daughter to her harpsichord, as was their evening ritual, but she begged to be excused that evening, pleading a violent headache. This remission was presently granted without argument, for indeed she seldom had occasion to ask him twice, as he loved her with such ardent affection that, by gratifying her slightest wishes, he commonly conveyed the highest gratification to himself. She was really what he frequently called her, his little darling, and she well deserved to be so, for she returned all his affection in the most ample manner. She had preserved the most inviolable duty to him in all things, and this her love made not only easy but so delightful that, when one of her more modern companions once laughed at her for placing so much merit in what that sophisticated young lady called scrupulous obedience, Sophia had answered with gentle dignity, "You mistake me, madam, if you think I value myself upon this account, for besides that I am barely discharging my natural duty, I am likewise pleasing myself. I can truly say I have no delight equal to that of contributing to my father's happiness, and if I value myself, my dear, it is on having this precious power, and not merely on executing it." This was a satisfaction, however, which poor Sophia found herself completely incapable of tasting this troubled evening. She therefore not only desired to be excused from her attendance at the harpsichord, but likewise begged that he would suffer her to absent herself from supper entirely. To this request, likewise, the squire agreed, though not without some reluctance, for he scarce ever permitted her to be out of his sight during meals, unless when he was engaged with his horses, his dogs, or his bottle. Nevertheless, he yielded to the desire of his beloved daughter, though the poor man was at the same time obliged to avoid his own company, if I may so express myself, by sending for a neighboring farmer to sit with him through the lonely evening, that the great hall might not echo quite so emptily. Tom Jones found himself in the unfortunate circumstance of having ridden one of Mr. Weston's finest horses that morning during the exhilarating chase across the countryside. The spirited animal had carried him through fields and over fences with tremendous energy, but now left him without a mount of his own in the squire's spacious stables. Thus he found himself obliged to make the journey home entirely on foot, a circumstance that would have deterred a less determined man. Yet Tom accomplished this pedestrian journey with such remarkable expedition that he covered upwards of 3 miles within the mere space of half an hour, his long legs carrying him with a speed born of urgent purpose, his mind racing even faster than his feet. Just as he arrived at Mr. Allworthy's outward gate, breathless and flushed with exertion, he met the constable and his company with Molly in their ungentle custody. They were conducting her toward that grim institution where the inferior sort of people may learn one particularly harsh lesson, namely respect and deference to their superiors. For such establishments must necessarily show them the wide distinction fortune intends between those persons who are to be corrected for their faults and those who are not. This lesson, if they fail to learn it within those stern walls, rarely leads to any other moral improvement. Despite the institution's purported purpose of reforming character through punishment and confinement, a lawyer of strict interpretation might perhaps think Mr. Allworthy exceeded his authority somewhat in this particular instance, and to speak truthfully, I must question whether his conduct was strictly regular, given that no formal information had been formally laid before him through proper channels. However, as his intention was truly upright and motivated by genuine concern for moral order rather than personal power, he ought to be excused in fora conscientiae in the court of conscience. This is especially true when we consider how many arbitrary acts are daily committed by magistrates who cannot plead this same purity of motive to justify their decisions. Tom was no sooner informed by the nervous constable whither they were proceeding. Indeed, he had pretty well guessed their destination himself than he acted with immediate and decisive passion. He caught Molly in his strong arms and embraced her tenderly before them all, his protective gesture a bold defiance of their official purpose. He swore with fierce determination that he would murder the first man who offered to lay hands upon her, his eyes flashing with such genuine menace that the constable's men stepped back involuntarily. He bid her dry her tears and be comforted, speaking in soothing tones that contrasted sharply with his previous vehemence. For wherever she went, he vowed he would accompany her, sharing her fate, whatever it might be. Then turning to the constable, who stood trembling with his hat respectfully removed, he desired him in a suddenly mild voice to return with him for just a moment to his father, for so he now called Allworthy, invoking that relationship with deliberate significance, for he dared to be assured, he said, that when he had alleged what he had to say in her favour, the girl would be promptly discharged from custody. The constable, who I make no doubt would have surrendered his prisoner, had Tom directly demanded her, very readily consented to this request. The authority in Tom's voice, combined with his connection to the esteemed Mr. Allworthy, made resistance seem both unwise and unnecessary. So back they all went into Mr. Allworthy's great hall, where Tom desired them to stay patiently till his return, and then went himself in immediate pursuit of the good man, his heart pounding with apprehension and resolve. As soon as he found Allworthy in his library, Tom threw himself dramatically at his feet, a gesture of both submission and supplication. Having begged a patient hearing with earnest desperation, he confessed himself to be the father of the child, of which Molly was then obviously big. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared hesitation might weaken his resolution. He entreated him to have compassion on the poor girl, and to consider that if there was any guilt in the case, it lay principally at his door, not hers. He presented himself as the true culprit, willing to bear the burden of responsibility. "If there is any guilt in the case," answered Allworthy warmly, his voice rising with moral indignation, "are you then so profligate and abandoned a libertine, to doubt whether breaking the laws of God and man, whether corrupting and ruining a poor girl constitutes guilt? I own indeed it doth lie principally upon you, and so heavy is that guilt that you ought to expect it should crush you beneath its weight. You have betrayed the trust I placed in you And more importantly, you have betrayed this young woman who placed her trust in you. Do you think Tom is doing the right thing by confessing? Like, if you respect his honesty, comment. If you think he's making things worse, whatever may be my fate, says Tom, his voice trembling with emotion but his gaze steady. Let me I'll succeed in my intercessions for the poor girl. I confess freely that I have corrupted her, but whether she shall be utterly ruined depends entirely on you. For heaven's sake, sir, I implore you, revoke your warrant, and do not send her to a place which must unavoidably prove her destruction. However I may deserve punishment, she does not deserve such a fate. Allworthy bid him immediately call a servant to summon the constable. Tom answered that there was no occasion for sending, for he had luckily met them at the gate, and relying upon his goodness, had brought them all back into his hall, where they now waited his final resolution. Still upon his knees, he besought him that this resolution might be in favor of the girl, that she might be permitted to go home to her parents, and not be exposed to a greater degree of shame and scorn than must necessarily fall upon her. I know, said he, his voice breaking with genuine remorse, that what has already occurred is too much. I know I am the wicked occasion of it. I will endeavor to make amends, if possible, and if you shall have hereafter the goodness to forgive me, I hope I shall deserve such forgiveness through my future conduct. Allworthy hesitated some time, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, disappointment warring with compassion, principle struggling with mercy. At last he said, Well, I will discharge my mitimus. You may send the constable to me. The constable was instantly called, formally discharged of his duty, and so was the trembling girl, who could scarcely believe her sudden deliverance. It will be readily believed that Mr. Allworthy failed not to read Tom a very severe lecture on this occasion, expounding at length on the gravity of his transgression and the consequences it might have wrought. But it is unnecessary to insert the full lecture here, as we have faithfully transcribed what he said to Jenny Jones in the first book of this history, and most of those admonitions may be applied to the men equally with the women. So sensible an effect had these reproofs on the young man, who was no hardened sinner but capable of genuine remorse, that he retired to his own room, where he passed the evening alone in much melancholy contemplation, wrestling with his conscience and the consequences of his actions. Allworthy was sufficiently offended by this transgression of Jones, for notwithstanding the jovial assertions of Mr. Weston, it is certain this worthy man had never indulged himself in any loose pleasures with women, and greatly condemned the vice of incontinence in others. Indeed, there is much reason to imagine that there was not the least truth in what Mr. Weston had affirmed, especially as he laid the scene of those alleged impurities at the university where Mr. Allworthy had never set foot. In fact, the good squire was a little too apt to indulge that kind of pleasantry which is generally called rhodomontade, boastful, extravagant talk, but which may, with as much propriety, be expressed by a much shorter word. And perhaps we too often supply the use of this little monosyllable by others, since very much of what frequently passes in the world for wit and humour should in the strictest purity of language receive that short appellation which, in conformity to the well-bred laws of custom, I here discreetly suppress. What consequences do you foresee for Tom after this confession subscribe to follow his dramatic story. But whatever detestation Mr. Allworthy had to this or to any other vice, he was not so blinded by it, but that he could discern any virtue in the guilty person as clearly, indeed, as if there had been no mixture of vice in the same character. While he was angry, therefore, with the incontinence of Jones, he was no less pleased with the honour and honesty of his self-accusation. He began now to form in his mind the same opinion of this young fellow which we hope our reader may have conceived, that of a fundamentally good nature, led astray by passion and youthful impetuosity, and in balancing his faults with his perfections, the latter seemed rather to preponderate in Allworthy's generous estimation. It was to no purpose, therefore, that Thwackum, who was immediately charged by Mr. Blifil with the scandalous story, unbended all his rancour against poor Tom. Allworthy gave a patient hearing to their invectives, their exaggerated accounts and moral condemnations, and then answered coldly that young men of Tom's complexion were too generally addicted to this vice. But he believed that youth was sincerely affected with what he had said to him on the occasion, and he hoped he would not transgress again, so that as the days of corporal punishment were at an end, the frustrated tutor had no other vent but his own mouth, for his gall, that usual poor resource of impotent revenge. But Square, who was a less violent, but much more artful man, proved more dangerous in his opposition, as he hated Jones more perhaps than Thwackum himself did, though for different, more philosophical reasons. So he contrived to do him more subtle mischief in the mind of Mr. Allworthy. The reader must remember the several little incidents of the partridge, the horse, and the Bible, which were recounted in the second book. By all these actions, Jones had rather improved than injured the affection which Mr. Allworthy was inclined to entertain for him. The same, I believe, must have happened to him with every other person who has any idea of friendship, generosity, and greatness of spirit, that is to say, who has any traces of goodness in his own mind and can recognize it in others. Square himself was not unacquainted with the true impression which those several instances of goodness had made on the excellent heart of Allworthy, for the philosopher very well knew what virtue was, though he was not always, perhaps, steady in its pursuit. But as for Thwackum, from what reason I will not determine, no such subtle thoughts ever entered into his head. He saw Jones only in a bad light, and he imagined Allworthy saw him in the same, but that he was resolved from pride and stubbornness of spirit not to give up the boy whom he had once cherished, since by so doing he must tacitly acknowledge that his former opinion of him had been wrong, a confession of error that does not come easily to any man. Square therefore embraced this opportunity of injuring Jones in the tenderest part by giving a very bad turn to all these before-mentioned occurrences. "I am sorry, sir," said he, assuming an expression of grave disappointment, "to own that I have been deceived as well as yourself. I could not, I confess, help being pleased with what I ascribed to the motive of friendship, though it was carried to an excess, and all excess is faulty and vicious. But in this I made allowance for youth and impetuosity. Little did I suspect that the sacrifice of truth which we both imagined to have been made to friendship was, in reality, a prostitution of it to a depraved and debauched appetite. You now plainly see whence all the seeming generosity of this young man to the family of the gamekeeper proceeded. He supported the father in order to corrupt the daughter and preserve the family from starving to bring one of them to shame and ruin. This is friendship. This is generosity. As Sir Richard Steele says, gluttons who give high prices for delicacies are very worthy to be called generous. In short, I am resolved from this instance never to give way to the weakness of human nature more, nor to think anything virtue which doth not exactly quadrate with the unerring rule of right. The native goodness of Allworthy had prevented these cynical considerations from occurring to himself. Yet were they too plausible to be absolutely and hastily rejected when laid before his eyes by another. Indeed, what Square had said sunk very deeply into his mind, and the uneasiness which it there created was very visible to the astute philosopher, though the good man would not acknowledge this perturbation. He made only a very slight answer, and forcibly drove off the discourse to some other subject. It was well perhaps for poor Tom that no such suggestions had been made before he was pardoned, for they certainly stamped in the mind of Allworthy the first bad impression concerning Jones's character, a subtle poison that would work slowly but surely in the days to come. The reader will be pleased, I believe, to return with me now to the troubled chambers of Sophia Weston, whose story we temporarily left to follow the dramatic fortunes of Tom Jones. She passed the night after we saw her last fleeing the dinner table in no very agreeable manner. The hours dragged by with excruciating slowness, each minute amplifying her distress. Sleep, that gentle refuge of the troubled mind, befriended her, but little offering only fitful moments of forgetfulness, and dreams, those mysterious visitors of the night, proved even less kind, presenting her with distorted visions that only heightened her waking anxieties. In the morning, when Mrs. Honor, her faithful maid, attended her at the usual hour, she was found already up, and dressed, her face pale but composed, having wrestled through the dark hours with her conflicting emotions. In the countryside, persons who live 2 or 3 miles distant are considered as next-door neighbors, their lives intertwined through a complex web of social connections. News and transactions at one house fly with incredible celerity to another, carried by servants, tradespeople, and busybodies with remarkable efficiency. Mrs. Honor, therefore, had already heard the whole scandalous story of Molly's shame through this intricate gossip network. Being of a very communicative and sociable temperament, she had no sooner entered the sunlit apartment of her mistress than she began to relate the tale in the following manner, her words tumbling out in excited clusters. "La, mum, what? Doth your lordship think you'll never credit the news that's flying about? That girl, the very one that your lordship saw at church on Sunday, whom you thought so handsome in her fine clothes, though to be sure you would not have thought her so handsome, neither if you had seen her nearer, for her complexion, once, improving something dreadful. Well, she hath been carried before the justice, for being big with child as plain as day. She seemed to me to look like a confident slut, from the very first, with that bold way of staring about her. And to be sure, she hath laid the child to young Mr. Jones, of all people, and all the parish says, Mr. Allworthy is so angry with young Mr. Jones that he won't see him. And there's been a terrible scene at the great house. To be sure, one can't help pitying the poor young man, in a way, and yet he doth not deserve much pity, neither for demeaning himself with such kind of trumpery. Yet he is so pretty a gentleman with such fine manners when he chooses, that I should be sorry to have him turned out of doors on account of such a creature. I dares to swear the wench was as willing as he, for she was always a forward kind of body, that Molly putting herself where she wasn't wanted. And when wenches are so coming, young men are not so much to be blamed neither, for to be sure they do no more than what is natural, being tempted so shamelessly. Indeed, it is beneath them to meddle with such dirty draggle-tails, and whatever happens to them, it is good enough for them, I say. And yet, to be sure, the vile baggages are most in fault, leading young gentlemen astray. I wishes with all my heart they were well to be whipped at the cart's tail through the village, for it is pity they should be the ruin of a pretty young gentleman, and nobody can deny but that Mr. Jones is one of the most handsomest young men that ever prediction. How do you think Sophia is handling this news? Like, if you feel sorry for her, comment with your prediction for her next move. She was running on thus, her words gaining momentum like a stream after rainfall, when Sophia, with a more peevish and sharp voice than she had ever spoken to her maid in before, cried out, Prithee, why dost thou trouble me with all this stuff and nonsense? What concern have I in what Mr. Jones doth or doth not do? I suppose you are all alike, you servants, with nothing better to do than gossip about your betters, and you seem to me to be almost angry that it was not your own case being discussed in such scandalous terms. I ma'am, answered Mrs. Honour, drawing herself up with injured dignity. I am sorry your ladyship should have such a low opinion of me. I am sure nobody can say any such thing of me, that I encourage such familiarities. All the young fellows in the world may go to the devil for me, for all I care, because I said he was a handsome man. Everybody says it as well as I. It's common talk in the county. To be sure, I never thought as it was any harm to say a young man was handsome, but to be sure, I shall never think him so any more now that his true character is revealed. For handsome is that handsome does, as the saying goes, a beggar wench, and him a gentleman. Stop thy torrent of impertinence, cries Sophia, her patience quite exhausted, and see whether my father wants me at breakfast. That at least is part of your proper duties, rather than repeating village gossip. Mrs. Honour then flung out of the room in a huff, muttering much to herself under her breath, of which Mary come up, I assure you, was all that could be plainly distinguished, the rest being lost in indistinct grumblings about ingratitude and the difficulty of serving fine ladies. Whether Mrs. Honour really deserved that suspicion, of which her mistress gave her a hint, that secret envy of Molly's situation, is a delicate matter which we cannot indulge our reader's curiosity by resolving with certainty. We will, however, make him amends in the most generous way possible by openly disclosing what actually passed in the private mind of Sophia during this trying time, laying bare her innermost thoughts without reservation. The attentive reader will be pleased to recollect that a secret affection for Mr. Jones had insensibly stolen into the innocent bosom of this young lady, much like morning mist creeps into a valley barely noticed until it has settled deeply, that it had there grown to a pretty great height before she herself had discovered its presence, its roots spreading through her heart without conscious permission. When she first began to perceive its symptoms, the quickened pulse at his approach, the unconscious smile at mention of his name, the sensations were so sweet and pleasing that she had not resolution sufficient to check or repel them, and thus she went on unconsciously, cherishing a passion of which she never once considered the consequences, like someone nurturing a beautiful plant without considering what fruit it might bear. This shocking incident relating to Molly first opened her eyes to her own precarious situation. She now first perceived the weakness of which she had been guilty in allowing her affections to stray so imprudently, and though it caused the utmost perturbation in her mind, yet it had the effect of other nauseous physic, unpleasant to take but ultimately curative. For the time being it completely expelled her distemper of misplaced affection. Its operation indeed was most wonderfully quick, and in the short interval, while her maid was absent from the room, so entirely removed all symptoms of her love sickness that when Mrs. Honor returned with a summons from her father, she had become perfectly composed and had brought herself through sheer force of will to a thorough indifference for Mr. Jones, or so she desperately tried to convince herself. Can true feelings be overcome by willpower alone? Subscribe to follow Sophia's emotional journey. The diseases of the mind do in almost every particular imitate those of the body, following similar patterns of onset, crisis, and either recovery or relapse, for which reason we hope that learned faculty of physicians, for whom we have so profound a respect, will pardon us the violent hands we have been necessitated to lay on several words and phrases which of right belong to them professionally. Without borrowing this medical terminology, our descriptions of mental states must have been often unintelligible or lacking in precision. Now there is no one circumstance in which the distempers of the mind bear a more exact analogy to those which are called bodily than that aptness which both have to a relapse after apparent recovery. This is plain in the violent diseases of ambition and avarice, which may seem cured, but flare up again at the slightest provocation. I have known ambition when cured at court by frequent disappointments, which are the only effective physic for it to break out again in a petty contest for foreman of the grand jury at an assizes. And I have heard of a man who had so far conquered avarice as to give away many a sixpence to the poor, who nevertheless comforted himself at last on his deathbed by making a crafty and advantageous bargain concerning his ensuing funeral with an undertaker who had married his only child, thus cheating death itself of full payment. In the particular affair of love, which out of strict conformity with the Stoic philosophy we shall here treat as a disease rather than a virtue, this proneness to relapse is no less conspicuous than in physical ailments. Thus it happened to poor Sophia, despite her best resolutions and firmest convictions, upon whom the very next time she saw young Jones, all the former symptoms returned with redoubled force, and from that time cold and hot fits alternately seized her heart, much as ague attacks the body, leaving her by turns flushed with hope and pale with despair. The situation of this young lady was now very different from what it had ever been before. That passion, which had formerly been so exquisitely delicious to contemplate, became now a scorpion in her bosom, its sting both painful and dangerous. She resisted it, therefore, with her utmost force, and summoned every argument her reason, which was surprisingly strong and developed for her age, could suggest to subdue and expel it from her breast. In this determined effort she so far succeeded, or believed she succeeded, that she began to hope from time and absence a perfect cure might eventually be achieved. She resolved, therefore, to avoid Tom Jones as much as possible, keeping both physical and mental distance from the source of her affliction, for which purpose she began to conceive a design of visiting her aunt in another county, to which scheme she made no doubt of obtaining her father's consent, given his fondness for indulging her wishes. But fortune, that capricious dame who had other designs in her head for our characters, put an immediate stop to any such proceeding towards safety and recovery. She did this by introducing an unexpected accident of considerable consequence, which will be related in full in the next chapter, and which would plunge our heroine into even deeper waters of emotional turmoil before her ultimate destiny became clear. Mr. Weston grew every day fonder and fonder of his daughter Sophia, his paternal affections deepening with such intensity that even his beloved pack of hunting dogs, those cherished companions of his outdoor pursuits, almost gave place to her in his heart. Yet, as he could not possibly prevail upon himself to abandon these canine friends, entirely being a man of firmly established habits, he contrived very cunningly to enjoy their boisterous company, together with that of his daughter. This he accomplished by insisting with increasing frequency that she accompany him in riding to the hunt, thus blending his two greatest affections into one glorious pastime. Sophia, to whom her father's word had always been as absolute as law, readily complied with his desires, despite her private reservations. She found no genuine delight in a sport which was of too rough and masculine a nature to suit properly with her gentle disposition. The thunder of hooves, the bloody conclusion of the chase, the crude shouts of the hunters, all these elements grated upon her refined sensibilities. However, she possessed another motive beyond mere filial obedience for accompanying the old gentleman in his favourite pursuit, for by her constant presence at his side she hoped in some measure to restrain his characteristically wild impetuosity, and to prevent him from so frequently exposing his aging neck to the utmost hazard by taking foolish jumps and riding at breakneck speeds. The strongest objection to this arrangement, one which would have formerly been a delightful inducement to her, was the inevitable and frequent meeting with young Jones, whom she had now firmly determined to avoid after the recent scandal. But as the end of the hunting season now approached with the advancing autumn, she comforted herself with the hope that a short absence at her aunt's estate would enable her to reason herself entirely out of her unfortunate passion. She had not any doubt of being able to meet him in the field the subsequent season without the least danger to her equanimity. Once time and distance had worked their curative magic upon her wounded heart. On the second day of her reluctant hunting participation, as she was returning from the chase amid the golden light of late afternoon, and was arrived within a little distance from Mr. Weston's house. Her horse, a spirited creature whose mettlesome temperament required a more experienced and forceful rider, fell suddenly to prancing and capering in such an alarming manner that she found herself in the most imminent peril of falling. The animal, sensing its rider's uncertainty, became increasingly unruly, its eyes rolling back to show the whites in equine panic. Tom Jones, who happened to be at a little distance behind, absorbed in his own melancholy thoughts, saw this developing danger with immediate alarm. Without a moment's hesitation, he galloped up to her assistance, his own horse responding to his urgent commands. As soon as he came alongside her struggling mount, he leapt gracefully from his own saddle with athletic ease and caught hold of hers by the bridle, speaking to the frightened beast in low, calming tones. The unruly animal, now thoroughly spooked, presently reared himself to his full height on his powerful hind legs, pawing at the air with his forefeet, and threw his lovely burden from his back in a terrifying arc. But Jones, anticipating this very development, was perfectly positioned to catch her in his strong, waiting arms, breaking her fall with his own body and holding her securely against his chest as they both tumbled to the soft turf. Were you holding your breath during that rescue scene? Like this video if you're invested in Tom and Sophia's story. She was so profoundly affected with the fright of the experience that she was not immediately able to satisfy Jones, who was very solicitous to know whether she had received any hurt. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and she clung to him momentarily as one clings to safety in a storm. She soon after, however, recovered her composure, assured him with a trembling voice that she was safe and unharmed, and thanked him with genuine warmth for the prompt care he had taken of her. Jones answered with equal feeling, "If I have preserved you from injury, madam, I am sufficiently repaid for any trouble, for I promise you I would have secured you from the least harm at the expense of a much greater misfortune to myself than I appear to have suffered on this occasion." "What misfortune?" replied Sophia eagerly, her eyes widening with fresh concern. "I hope you have not come to any serious mischief yourself in my service." "Be not concerned on my account, madam," answered Jones, with attempted nonchalance, though his face had grown noticeably pale. "Heaven be praised, you have escaped so well, considering the considerable danger you were in. If I have merely broke my arm in the process, I consider it as a trifling inconvenience in comparison of what I feared might happen upon your account." Sophia then screamed out with involuntary distress, "Broke your arm? Heaven forbid that it should be so. I am afraid I have, madam," says Jones, attempting a brave smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "But I beg you will suffer me first to take care of your own safety. I have a right hand yet at your service, perfectly functional to help you into the next field, whence we have but a very little walk to reach your father's house and proper assistance." Sophia, seeing his left arm, now dangling uselessly by his side while he was using his right arm to support her, no longer doubted the painful truth of his injury. She now grew much paler than her fears for herself had made her before, the colour draining from her cheeks as the full extent of his sacrifice became apparent. All her limbs were seized with a violent trembling, insomuch that Jones could scarce support her steady, and as her thoughts were in no less agitation, she could not refrain from giving Jones a look so full of unconscious tenderness and gratitude that it almost argued a stronger sensation in her mind than even gratitude and pity united can raise in the gentlest female bosom without the assistance of that third, more powerful passion which she had been so determined to suppress. Mr. Weston, who was advanced at some distance ahead when this accident happened, was now returned at a gallop, as were the rest of the horsemen who had been riding with them. Sophia immediately acquainted them with what had befallen her gallant rescuer, and begged them with unusual urgency to take proper care of him, upon which Weston, who had been much alarmed by the sight of his daughter's riderless horse, and was now overjoyed to find her apparently unhurt, cried out with characteristic bluntness, "I am glad it is no worse. Then, if Tom hath broken his arm, we will get a joiner to mend again. I warrant we've excellent carpenters in the village, or perhaps the blacksmith might do better with that sort of work." The squire alighted from his own lathered horse and proceeded to his house on foot, walking between his daughter and the injured Jones, creating a most unusual procession. An impartial spectator, who had met them on the way, would on viewing their several countenances have concluded Sophia alone to have been the object of compassion, so pale and shaken did she appear. For as to Jones, despite his obvious pain, he seemed to exult in having probably saved the life of the young lady at the price only of a broken bone, counting it a favourable bargain. And Mr. Weston, though he was not completely unconcerned at the accident which had befallen Jones, was, however, delighted in a much higher degree with the fortunate escape of his daughter, his primary treasure. "Do you think this accident will bring Tom and Sophia closer? Comment with your prediction below." The natural generosity of Sophia's temper construed this brave behaviour of Jones into an act of heroic self-sacrifice, and it made a deep and lasting impression on her susceptible heart. For certain it is that there is no one quality which so generally recommends men to women as demonstrated courage, proceeding, if we believe the common opinion, from that natural timidity of the sex, which is, as Mr. Osborne rather uncharitably asserts, so great, that a woman is the most cowardly of all the creatures God ever made, a sentiment more remarkable for its bluntness than for its truth or chivalry. Aristotle in his Politics doth them, I believe, more justice, when he says, "The modesty and fortitude of men differ from those virtues in women, for the fortitude which becomes a woman would be cowardice in a man, and the modesty which becomes a man would be pertness in a woman. Nor is there perhaps more of truth in the opinion of those who derive the partiality which women are inclined to show to the brave from this supposed excess of their fear." Mr. Bayle, I think, in his article on Helen, imputes this preference, and with greater probability, to their violent love of glory, for the truth of which we have the authority of him who of all others saw farthest into human nature, the immortal Homer, who introduces the heroine of his Odyssey, the great pattern of matrimonial love and constancy, the faithful Penelope, assigning the glory of her husband as the primary source of her affection towards him. However this philosophical debate be resolved, certain it is that the accident operated very strongly on Sophia's impressionable heart, reviving all those feelings she had determined to suppress. And indeed, after much careful inquiry into the matter through various sources, I am inclined to believe that at this very moment of crisis, the charming Sophia made no less profound an impression on the heart of Jones than he had made upon hers. To speak truth, he had for some time become increasingly sensible of the irresistible power of her charms. But now, with her looking up at him with such tender concern, he felt his own resolutions against love melting away as snow before the irresistible power. Spring Sunday. When the peculiar procession finally arrived at Mr. Weston's great hall, Sophia, who had tottered along with much difficulty, supported by her father and the injured Jones, sank down immediately into the nearest chair, her strength entirely spent. The combined effects of her fright, the fall, and the emotional turmoil left her pale and trembling. By the timely assistance of hartshorn and water, administered by a concerned servant, she was fortunately prevented from fainting away completely, and had pretty well recovered her composure, when the surgeon, who had been urgently sent for to attend to Jones, made his appearance, bustling in with professional importance. Mr. Weston, who imputed these distressing symptoms in his daughter entirely to the physical effects of her fall, advised in his blunt manner that she should be presently blooded by way of prevention against more serious complications. In this medical opinion, he was strongly seconded by the surgeon, who gave so many learned reasons for the procedure, and quoted so many alarming cases where persons had miscarried for want of timely bleeding, that the squire became very importunate, and indeed insisted peremptorily that his daughter should undergo the operation immediately. Sophia, though feeling perfectly recovered from her initial fright, soon yielded to the commands of her father, though it was entirely contrary to her own inclinations and better judgment, for she suspected, I believe, less actual danger from the fright than either the squire or the surgeon imagined, understanding her own constitution better than they did. Nevertheless, she obediently stretched out her beautiful arm, white and slender, and the operator began to prepare his instruments for his work with solemn ceremony, while the servants were busied in providing the necessary materials, basins, cloths, and bandages. The surgeon, who imputed the slight backwardness which had appeared in Sophia's manner to natural feminine fears, began to comfort her with condescending assurances that there was not the least danger in the procedure, for no accident, he said with professional pride, could ever happen in bleeding when performed by a qualified practitioner, but only from the monstrous ignorance of pretenders to surgery, which he pretty plainly insinuated was not at present to be apprehended in his own competent hands. Sophia declared with some dignity that she was not under the least apprehension for herself, adding with a touch of ironic humor, "If you should accidentally open an artery instead of a vein, I promise you I'll forgive you the error." "Will you?" cries Weston with more heat than the situation warranted. "D.N. me if I will. If he does thee the least mischief through his clumsiness, D.N. me if I don't ha' the heart's blood owing out in return, I swear it." The surgeon, somewhat taken aback, assented to bleed her upon these violent conditions, and then proceeded to his operation, which he performed with as much dexterity as he had promised, and with as much quickness, for he took but little blood, from her saying wisely that it was much safer to bleed again and again, if necessary, than to take away too much at once and weaken the patient. Do you think 18th century medical practices like bleeding were helpful or harmful? Like for helpful, comment for harmful Sophia, when her arm was properly bound up, retired from the hall for she was not willing, nor was it perhaps strictly decent to be present at the ensuing operation on Jones's broken arm. Indeed, one unspoken objection which she had to her own bleeding, though she did not voice it, was the delay which it would occasion to setting the poor man's broken bone. For Weston, when his daughter's welfare was concerned, had no consideration for anyone else, and as for Jones himself, during this interim he sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief, as the poet says. To speak truth, when he had seen the rich red blood springing from the lovely white arm of Sophia, he had scarce thought of what had happened to himself. So absorbed was he in concern for her. The surgeon now ordered his male patient to be stripped to his shirt, and then entirely baring the injured arm, he began to stretch and examine it in such a rough manner that the tortures he put him to caused Jones to make several wry faces, despite his efforts at stoicism, which the surgeon, observing greatly, wondered at, crying with some irritation, "What is the matter, sir? I am sure it is impossible. I should hurt you if you would, but remain still." And then, holding forth the broken arm as if it were a specimen, he began a long and very learned lecture of anatomy in which simple and double fractures were most accurately considered, and the several ways in which Jones might have broken his arm were discussed with proper annotations, showing how many of these theoretical possibilities would have been better and how many worse than the present case. Having at length finished his labored harangue, with which the audience, though it had greatly raised their attention and admiration, were not much actually edified, as they really understood not a single syllable of all his technical jargon, he proceeded to the business of setting the bone, which he was more expeditious in finishing than he had been in beginning his lecture. Jones was then ordered into a nearby bed, which Mr. Weston compelled him to accept at his house, rather than journey home in his condition, and sentence of water gruel was passed upon him as appropriate nourishment for an invalid. Among the good company which had attended in the hall during the bone-setting Mrs. Honor was one of the most interested observers, who, being summoned to her mistress as soon as the operation was over, and asked by her how the young gentleman did, presently launched into extravagant praises on the magnanimity, as she called it, of his behavior during the painful procedure, which she said was so charming in so pretty a creature. She then burst forth into much warmer encomiums on the beauty of his person now that she had seen him stripped to his shirt, enumerating many particulars with increasing enthusiasm, and ending with special emphasis on the whiteness of his skin, which seemed to have made a particular impression on her. This frank discourse had an immediate effect on Sophia's countenance, which would not perhaps have escaped the observance of the sagacious waiting woman had she once looked her mistress directly in the face during her whole speech. But as a looking-glass, which was most commodiously placed opposite to where Mrs. Honor stood, gave her an opportunity of surveying her own features, in which of all others she took most delight. So she had not once removed her eyes from that amiable object during her whole speech, quite fascinated with her own reflection. Mrs. Honor was so entirely wrapped up in the subject on which she exercised her tongue and the object before her eyes that she gave her mistress time to conquer her initial confusion, which, having done, Sophia smiled on her maid with recovered composure and told her she was certainly in love with this young fellow herself, to praise him so extravagantly. "I, in love, madam," answers she with pretended shock. "Upon my word, ma'am, I assure you, ma'am, upon my soul, ma'am, I am not in the least. Why, if you was," cries her mistress with apparent casualness, "I see no reason that you should be ashamed of it, for he is certainly a pretty fellow, as you say." "Yes, ma'am," answered the other, warming to the subject again, "that he is the most handsomest man I ever saw in my life." "Yes, to be sure that he is, and as your ladyship says, I don't know why I should be ashamed of loving him, though he is my betters. To be sure gentlefolks are but flesh and blood no more than us servants. Besides, as for Mr. Jones, though Squire Allworthy hath made a gentleman of him, he was not so good as myself by birth. For though I am a poor body, I am an honest person's child, and my father and mother were properly married, which is more than some people can say as high as they hold their heads. Marry, come up, I assure you, my dirty cousin, though his skin be so white, and to be sure, it is the most whitest that ever was seen. I am a Christian as well as he, and nobody can say that I am. Base-born, my grandfather was a clergyman, and would have been very angry, I believe, to have thought any of his family should have taken up with Molly Seagrim's dirty leavings. Who do you think understands love better, Sophia or Mrs. Honor? Comment your thoughts below. Perhaps Sophia might have suffered her maid to run on in this manner from wanting sufficient spirits to stop her tongue after the day's exertions, which the reader may probably conjecture was no very easy task with such a talkative woman, for certainly there were some passages in her speech which were far from being agreeable to the lady, particularly the reference to Molly Seagrim. However, she now checked the torrent of words, as there seemed no end of its flowing, once Mrs. Honor found a subject to her liking. "I wonder," says she, with some severity at your assurance in daring to talk thus of one of my father's friends. "As to the wench you mentioned, I order you never to mention her name to me again, and with regard to the young gentleman's birth, those who can say nothing more to his disadvantage may as well be silent on that head, as I desire you will be for the future." "I am sorry I have offended your ladyship," answered Mrs. Honor, suddenly contrite. "I am sure I hate Molly Seagrim as much as your ladyship can, and as for abusing Squire Jones, I can call all the servants in the house to witness that whenever any talk hath been about bastards, I have always taken his part. For which of you, says I to the footmen, would not be a bastard if he could to be made a gentleman of? And says I am sure he is a very fine gentleman, and he hath one of the whitest hands in the world, for to be sure, so he hath. And says I, one of the sweetest, temperedest, best naturedest men in the world he is. And says I, all the servants and neighbours all round the country loves him. And to be sure I could tell your ladyship something about him, but that I am afraid it would offend you." "What could you tell me, Honor?" says Sophia, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "Nay, ma'am, to be sure he meant nothing by it. Therefore I would not have your ladyship be offended. Prithee, tell me, says Sophia, with increasing interest. I will know it this instant. Why, ma'am, answered Mrs. Honor, lowering her voice conspiratorially, he came into the room one day last week when I was at work, and there lay your ladyship's muff on a chair, and to be sure, he put his hands into it. That very muff your ladyship gave me, but yesterday, la, says I, Mr. Jones, you will stretch my lady's muff and spoil it, but he still kept his hands in it, and then he kissed it to be sure. I hardly ever saw such a kiss in my life as he gave it. I suppose he did not know it was mine, replied Sophia, trying to maintain indifference. Your ladyship shall hear, ma'am, continued Honor, enjoying her role as bearer of interesting intelligence. He kissed it again and again, and said it was the prettiest muff in the world. La, sir, says I, you have seen it 100 times. Yes, Mrs. Honor, cried he, but who can see anything beautiful in the presence of your lady but herself? Nay, that's not all neither, but I hope your ladyship won't be offended, for to be sure, he meant nothing. One day, as your ladyship was playing on the harpsichord to my master Mr. Jones, was sitting in the next room, and methought he looked melancholy. La, says I, Mr. Jones, what's the matter a penny for your thoughts? Says I. Why, hussy, says he, starting up from a dream, what can I be thinking of when that angel your mistress is playing? And then squeezing me by the hand, oh, Mrs. Honor, says he, how happy will that man be? And then he sighed, upon my troth his breath is as sweet as a nosegay. But to be sure, he meant no harm by it, so I hope your ladyship will not mention a word, for he gave me a crown never to mention it, and made me swear upon a book, but I believe indeed it was not the Bible, till something of a more beautiful red than vermilion be found out by artists. I shall say nothing of Sophia's colour on this occasion, which deepened remarkably. Oh, now, says she, struggling to maintain her composure, if you will not mention this any more to me, nor to anybody else, I will not betray you. I mean, I will not be angry, but I am afraid of your tongue. Why, my girl, will you give it such liberties? Nay, ma'am, answered she, to be sure I would sooner cut out my tongue than offend your ladyship. To be sure I shall never mention a word that your ladyship would not have me. Why, I would not have you mention this any more, said Sophia, for it may come to my father's ears, and he would be angry with Mr. Jones, though I really believe, as you say, he meant nothing. I should be very angry myself if I imagined. Nay, ma'am, says Honor, I protest, I believe he meant nothing improper. I thought he talked as if he was out of his senses. Nay, he said he believed he was beside himself when he had spoken the words. Aye, sir, says I believe so too. Yes, says he, Honor, but I ask your ladyship's pardon. I could tear my tongue out for offending you. Go on, says Sophia, unable to resist hearing more. You may mention anything you have not told me before. Yes, Honor, says he. This was some time afterwards when he gave me the crown. I am neither such a coxcomb or such a villain as to think of her in any other light but as my goddess. As such I will always worship and adore her while I have breath. This was all, ma'am, I will be sworn to the best of my remembrance. I was in a passion with him myself, till I found he meant no harm. Indeed, Honour, says Sophia, visibly softened. I believe you have a real affection for me. I was provoked the other day when I gave you warning, but if you have a desire to stay with me, you shall. To be sure, ma'am, answered Mrs. Honour with genuine relief. I shall never desire to part with your ladyship. To be sure, I almost cried my eyes out when you gave me warning. It would be very ungrateful in me to desire to leave your ladyship, because as why I should never get so good a place again, I am sure I would live and die with your ladyship. For as poor Mr. Jones said, happy is the man. Here the dinner bell interrupted a conversation which had wrought such an effect on Sophia that she was perhaps more obliged to her bleeding in the morning than she at the time had apprehended she should be. The loss of blood had possibly calmed her spirits enough to receive these revelations without betraying too much emotion. As to the present precise situation of her mind after these disclosures, I shall adhere to a wise rule of Horace by not attempting to describe it in detail from despair of success. Most of my readers will suggest it easily to themselves from their own knowledge of the human heart, and the few who cannot would not understand the picture, even if I drew it ever so well, or at least would deny it to be natural, as people often do when confronted with emotions they have not themselves experienced. And thus, dear reader, we reach the final chapter of our extensive history, the point at which we must bid farewell to the characters who have accompanied us through these many pages. The story of Tom Jones and Sophia Weston, which began in mystery and progressed through such labyrinthine paths of misfortune, misunderstanding, and moral complexity, now finds its proper resolution in the harmonious chords of virtue rewarded and love fulfilled. Tom Jones, that spirited though imperfect youth whose origins once clouded his prospects, has, through trial and error, ultimately proven worthy of both Mr. Allworthy's continued affection and Sophia's noble heart. His journey from reckless imprudence to responsible maturity stands as testament to the educative power of experience and the inherent goodness of his nature, which needed only proper direction to shine forth with genuine virtue. The errors of his past, while not insignificant, have been redeemed by his essential goodness of heart and his demonstrated capacity for moral growth. The lovely Sophia, whose beauty of character equals that of her person, has navigated the treacherous waters of familial obligation and heartfelt affection with remarkable wisdom for one so young. Her initial attraction to Jones, though temporarily obscured by circumstances that seemed to condemn him, has been justified by subsequent revelations of his true worth. In choosing to follow both her heart's inclination and her reason's approval, she exemplifies that rare balance of passion and principle which constitutes true feminine excellence. Mr. Allworthy, that paradigm of benevolent authority, has had his initial judgment of Tom's character vindicated, though not without periods of doubt and disappointment. His steadfast commitment to justice, tempered with mercy, provides the moral foundation upon which this entire edifice of human comedy and drama has been constructed. In the final reconciliation between guardian and ward, we see the triumphant affirmation of his philosophy that true virtue, though sometimes slow to manifest, will ultimately reveal itself, Even the boisterous Squire Weston, in his own uncouth way, has contributed to the happy resolution, in his initial opposition to the match giving way to acceptance once Tom's essential worthiness and Sophia's determined preference became impossible to ignore. In this transformation, we witness the power of genuine affection to soften even the most stubborn of dispositions. As for the various impediments to our lovers' happiness, the scheming, blithful, the hypocritical, thwackum, the philosophically flexible, square, each has received their appropriate comeuppance, proving that while villainy may achieve temporary successes, it cannot ultimately prevail against consistent virtue and truth.